The museum is closed for the night, and for a brief interval it exists in a condition that is neither defined by absence nor by display, a space in which the works it contains are no longer mediated by the movement of visitors, but instead held within a quieter structure of attention, where paintings and sculptures appear less as objects to be encountered and more as propositions to be considered, and where the names that surround them, Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, Donatello, begin to detach from their familiarity and reappear not as simple identifiers, but as organizing structures through which these works are seen, remembered, and understood, so that one moves through its galleries not only in the presence of images, but within a system in which certain names recur with such consistency and authority that they appear inseparable from the works themselves, shaping the very conditions under which those works acquire meaning, and giving rise, in the stillness of the museum, to a question that is not limited to what these works represent, but extends to why these particular names have come to define them, and how the relationship between object and author has been constructed in such a way that the presence of one seems to guarantee the significance of the other. To ask this question is to move beyond the immediate experience of the image, and into the conditions under which that experience is framed. The Renaissance is often described as a period of rebirth, a moment in which the study of antiquity, the development of perspective, and the increasing attention to the natural world produced a transformation in how images are made and understood. Yet this transformation is not limited to technique or subject matter. It extends to the very conception of the artist. In earlier periods, the makers of images frequently remained anonymous, their works embedded within systems of liturgical function, workshop production, and collective practice. The image belongs to a structure of use rather than to an individual identity. By the 16th century, however, this condition had altered. Works are increasingly associated with specific individuals whose lives, personalities, and intellectual capacities become integral to the interpretation of the objects they produce. The painting is no longer encountered solely as a representation. It is encountered as the product of a mind, a manifestation of a particular way of seeing and thinking. The museum, in preserving and presenting these works, also preserves and presents the idea of the artist as a distinct and elevated figure. This shift is neither inevitable nor neutral. It is the result of a series of historical processes that reconfigure the relationship between labor and knowledge, between making and thinking, between object and author. The elevation of the artist is accompanied by the development of new forms of discourse, treatises, biographies, critical writings, that articulate and reinforce this new status. The language through which art is described changes accordingly. Terms such as invenzione, disegno, and ingegno emerge to describe not only the technical aspects of artistic production, but the intellectual and creative capacities that underlie them. The artist is no longer defined primarily by the ability to execute a task, but by the ability to conceive, to imagine, to organize. This conceptual shift is reflected in the increasing emphasis on drawing as the foundation of artistic practice, not merely as a preparatory stage, but as a form of thinking in itself. To draw is to analyze, to construct, to understand. The line becomes a vehicle of cognition, and the act of drawing becomes inseparable from the act of knowing. Within this context, the works that populate the museum acquire an additional layer of meaning. They are not only objects to be seen, they are evidence of processes, traces of decisions, manifestations of intellectual activity. The surface of a painting, the chisel marks of a sculpture, the compositional arrangement of figures within a space. All of these elements can be read as indications of how an artist has engaged with a set of problems. How is space constructed? How is the human body represented? How does light define form? These questions, which might appear technical, are in fact deeply philosophical. They concern the relationship between appearance and reality, between perception and knowledge, between the visible and the intelligible. The Renaissance artist operates within this field of inquiry, and the works that result from this operation are shaped by the ways in which these questions are posed and addressed. Yet the museum does not present these questions in their original form. It presents their outcomes, organized according to a narrative that has been constructed after the fact. The arrangement of works, the selection of artists, the attribution of significance, all of these elements contribute to the formation of a canon, a set of objects and names that are taken to represent the highest achievements of a period. This canon is not fixed. It is subject to revision, to expansion, to critique. Nevertheless, certain figures maintain a central position within it, their status reinforced by repetition, by institutional validation, by the persistence of their presence within both scholarly discourse and popular imagination. The Renaissance, as it is commonly understood, is in large part defined through these figures. To speak of the Renaissance is, in many cases, to speak of Leonardo, of Michelangelo, of Raphael, of Donatello. Their works become emblematic of the period, and their names become synonymous with its achievements. The persistence of these names raises a further question. What does it mean to be a master? The term itself suggests a hierarchy, a distinction between those who achieve a certain level of excellence and those who do not. It implies authority, control, and a degree of autonomy that is not available to all practitioners. In the context of the Renaissance, the concept of mastery is closely tied to the idea of genius, a quality that is understood to be both rare and transformative. Genius, in this formulation, is not merely a matter of skill. It is a capacity for invention, for the creation of forms and ideas that extend beyond established conventions. It is a quality that positions the artist as an originator, as someone who does not simply follow rules, but who establishes them. The identification of certain artists as geniuses is therefore not simply descriptive. It is constitutive. It produces a category through which works are interpreted and valued. At the same time, the attribution of genius can obscure the conditions under which artistic production occurs. The works that are now associated with individual names are often the result of collaborative processes involving workshops, assistants, and a network of patrons and institutions that provide both resources and constraints. The image of the solitary genius, working in isolation, is a construction that simplifies a more complex reality. It emphasizes individuality at the expense of context, invention at the expense of tradition, autonomy at the expense of dependence. To recognize this is not to diminish the achievements of the artist in question, but to situate those achievements within a broader framework, one that acknowledges the interplay between individual capacity and collective structure. As we move through the galleries of the museum, then, the task is not only to observe the works themselves, but to consider the systems that have shaped their presence. The Renaissance is not simply a period of artistic innovation. It is a period in which the conditions of artistic recognition are transformed. The emergence of the artist as a central figure, the development of discourses that articulate and reinforce this status, the formation of a canon that organizes works and names into a coherent narrative. These processes are as significant as the techniques and subjects that define the works themselves. To understand the Renaissance is therefore to understand not only how images are made, but how they are framed, how they are remembered, and how they are attributed. In the quiet of the museum, before the arrival of the first visitors, these questions take on a particular clarity. Without the movement of the crowd, without the mediation of guided tours or explanatory labels, the works stand in a different relation to the space around them. They appear less as objects of consumption and more as points of inquiry, inviting a form of attention that is both sustained and reflective. It is within this space that we begin our exploration, not with the assumption that the greatness of these masters is self-evident, but with the recognition that such greatness has been constructed, articulated, and preserved through a series of historical decisions. The names that we encounter are not merely given, they are produced. To understand how they are produced is to understand something fundamental about the nature of art, about the ways in which it is valued, and about the role it plays in shaping our perception of the past. The figure of the artist as an exceptional individual, endowed with a distinctive capacity for invention and intellectual insight, is not an inherent feature of artistic practice. It is the result of a historical transformation that takes place over the course of the Renaissance. Prior to this transformation, the production of images is largely embedded within systems that prioritize function over authorship. In the medieval period, painters and sculptors operated within guild structures that regulate training, materials, and modes of production. Works are commissioned for specific purposes, whether liturgical, devotional, or civic, and their value is determined by their efficacy within these contexts, rather than by the identity of the maker. Attribution exists, but it does not occupy the central position that it will later assume. The image is understood as part of a broader system of meaning, one that extends beyond the individual who produces it. The emphasis falls on continuity, on adherence to established forms, and on the transmission of techniques from one generation to the next. Otto Pecht and Hans Belting have both emphasized that medieval image-making operates within a regime in which function, presence, and ritual efficacy take precedence over authorship, situating the object within a network of use rather than within a framework of individual expression. The transition to a different conception of the artist begins in the 15th century, as a series of intellectual, economic, and cultural developments alter the conditions under which artistic work is produced and understood. One of the most significant of these developments is the increasing engagement with classical antiquity, mediated through the study of ancient texts and objects. Humanist scholars, in their efforts to recover and reinterpret the literature and philosophy of the classical world, also contribute to a re-evaluation of the visual arts. Texts such as Vitruvius's De Architectura provide models for understanding artistic practice as a form of knowledge, grounded in principles that can be analyzed, articulated, and taught. The emphasis on proportion, harmony, and the relationship between parts and whole aligns the visual arts with disciplines traditionally associated with intellectual inquiry. This alignment creates the conditions for a redefinition of artistic labor, one that positions the artist not merely as a craftsman, but as a thinker. Paul Oskar Christler's analysis of Renaissance humanism demonstrates that this shift is inseparable from a broader reorganization of knowledge, in which disciplines are reclassified according to their intellectual content rather than their practical application. Leon Battista, Alberti's De Pictura, articulates this transformation with particular clarity, not because it introduces entirely new techniques, but because it defines painting as a rational and theoretical enterprise. Alberti presents painting as grounded in geometry and optics, a practice that requires the ability to construct a coherent representation of space through the application of measurable principles. The painter, in this formulation, organizes visual information according to rules that can be learned, analyzed, and transmitted. The metaphor of the painting as an open window establishes a model in which the image functions as a transparent plane through which a constructed world is viewed. This model presupposes a viewer whose position is fixed and whose perception is guided by the structure of the image, and it presupposes an artist capable of constructing such a structure. Hubert Darmisch's analysis of perspective as a theoretical object further demonstrates that this model is not merely technical. It produces a conceptual framework in which vision itself is ordered and stabilized, transforming perception into a domain that can be subjected to rational control. The implications of Alberti's formulation extend beyond technique into the reconfiguration of artistic status. By aligning the visual arts with mathematics and philosophy, Alberti contributes to their elevation within the hierarchy of knowledge. The distinction between liberal and mechanical arts begins to shift, as painting is reclassified on the grounds that it requires intellectual capacity as well as manual skill. This reclassification provides a language through which artistic practice can be discussed in terms of knowledge, invention, and reasoning. Martin Kemp has argued that this alignment between art and science produces a new conception of the artist as a figure capable of integrating empirical observation with theoretical understanding, positioning artistic practice within the broader epistemological transformations of the early modern period. The consolidation of this new status depends not only on theoretical discourse, but on the construction of a historical narrative that organizes artistic production around individual achievement. Giorgio Vasari's Le vite più eccellenti pittori, scultori e architettori provides this narrative with unprecedented coherence and influence. Vasari's work is not simply a collection of biographies. It is a structured account of artistic development in which the lives of artists serve as the primary framework through which works are interpreted. The progression of art is described as a sequence of stages, culminating in the achievements of figures such as Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael. This structure introduces a teleological model in which artistic development is understood as a process of improvement, moving toward a condition of perfection. Vasari's narrative establishes the conditions under which the artist becomes a central figure of historical interpretation. Artistic achievements are attributed to individual agency, and works are read as expressions of the intellect and character of their makers. Concepts such as disegno, invenzione, and maniera become central criteria for evaluating artistic quality, emphasizing the intellectual dimensions of artistic production. Patricia Rubin and Paul Borolsky have demonstrated that Vasari's text operates as both history and rhetorical construction, shaping the perception of artists through narrative strategies that elevate certain figures while marginalizing others. The identification of artistic excellence is therefore inseparable from the language through which it is described. Within this framework, the concept of ingegno emerges as a defining attribute of the exceptional artist. Genius is understood not as technical proficiency alone, but as the capacity for invention, for the creation of forms and ideas that extend beyond established conventions. This concept produces a hierarchy in which certain individuals are distinguished from their contemporaries and positioned as originators rather than participants. Ernst Kriss and Otto Kurz, in their study of artist legends, have shown that such narratives are structured through recurring motifs that reinforce the idea of the artist as exceptional, often emphasizing precocity, inspiration, and singularity. These narratives do not merely describe artistic achievement. They produce the conditions under which such achievement can be recognized. The impact of Vasari's model extends into the institutional structures that emerge in subsequent centuries. The organization of museums, the development of academies, and the formation of art historical discourse all reflect the centrality of the artist as a category of analysis. Works are classified according to authorship, and the evaluation of art becomes inseparable from the evaluation of individual creators. Donald Preciosi has argued that art history itself is structured by this model, functioning as a discipline that organizes objects into narratives centered on authorship, development, and influence. The concept of the great artist is therefore not only a historical phenomenon, but a methodological foundation. Modern scholarship has sought to interrogate this foundation by shifting attention toward the systems within which artistic production occurs. Ernst Gombrich's emphasis on tradition and problem-solving challenges the notion of isolated genius, suggesting that innovation emerges through the modification of existing conventions. Michael Baxendall's concept of the period eye situates artistic style within culturally specific modes of perception, emphasizing that both production and reception are conditioned by social practices. T.J. Clarke's analysis of art and ideology foregrounds the relationship between artistic production and structures of power, demonstrating that images are embedded within economic and political contexts that shape their meaning. Pierre Bourdieu's theory of cultural production further extends this analysis by situating artistic practice within a field of social relations in which value is negotiated and constructed rather than inherent. These approaches reveal that the figure of the artist as an autonomous creator is a constructed position, one that emerges through the interaction of discourse, institutions, and practices. The emphasis on individuality obscures the collaborative and material conditions under which works are produced, including workshop structures, patronage systems, and the circulation of images. Svetlana Alpers and Hans Belting have both emphasized that the modern concept of art, and by extension the artist, is historically contingent, shaped by specific cultural and institutional developments that define what counts as an image, an author, and a work. Despite these critiques, the model established in the Renaissance remains deeply embedded in contemporary understandings of art. The organization of exhibitions around individual artists, the emphasis on biography, and the valorization of originality all derive from the historical processes that have been outlined. The museum plays a central role in maintaining and reinforcing this model by presenting works under the names of their creators and arranging them within narratives of development and influence. Carol Duncan has shown that the museum functions as a ritual space in which visitors engage with these narratives, internalizing the values that structure them. The encounter with the artwork is therefore mediated by the institutional framework that presents it. To understand the Renaissance is to understand not only the works that it produces, but the mechanisms through which those works are framed, interpreted, and remembered. The invention of the great artist is a central component of this process, shaping both historical narratives and contemporary perceptions. It determines which names are preserved, which works are elevated, and which modes of interpretation are considered legitimate. The task is not to reject this construction, but to analyze it, to understand how it operates, and to recognize its implications for the ways in which art is experienced. As the inquiry moves forward, the figures who have come to embody this concept of mastery will be examined not as isolated geniuses, but as participants in systems of knowledge, production, and representation that define the Renaissance. Their works will be approached as manifestations of different modes of thinking, different strategies for engaging with the problems of perception, material, and meaning. The museum, in this context, is not a neutral space of display, but a structure that organizes these works into narratives that continue to shape their interpretation. To move through it is to engage with a history that is both constructed and persistent, a history in which the artist remains a central figure, even as the conditions of that centrality are subjected to critical scrutiny. If the Renaissance produces the artist as an identifiable and elevated subject, it does so not by establishing a uniform model of creativity, but by differentiating the conditions under which artistic thinking becomes legible as a form of knowledge. The category of the great master is therefore not a stable designation, but a retrospective construction that gathers together heterogeneous practices under the appearance of coherence. To treat Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, and Donatello as participants in a single trajectory toward artistic perfection is to overlook the extent to which their works articulate incompatible assumptions about vision, form, and the relation between making and knowing. The problem is not one of ranking or stylistic variation, but of epistemology. What constitutes knowledge in the visual arts, and how is that knowledge produced, validated, and transmitted through images? The shift from workshop-based production to the articulation of the artist as an intellectual agent requires that artistic practice be understood in relation to discourses traditionally associated with philosophy, science, and rhetoric. Leon Battista Alberti's De Pictura situates painting within a framework of geometry and optics, proposing that the construction of the image depends upon the rational organization of visual experience. The painter, in Alberti's formulation, does not simply imitate nature. He constructs a system through which nature can be represented according to principles that are both intelligible and communicable. This alignment of painting with the liberal arts establishes the conditions under which artistic practice can be evaluated in terms of intellectual rigor, rather than manual execution. Yet Alberti's model does not exhaust the possibilities of artistic thinking. It provides one account of how images can be constructed, but it does not determine how artists will engage with the problems it identifies. Leonardo da Vinci's writings complicate Alberti's framework by redefining the relationship between painting and knowledge. In the Trattato della Pittura, Leonardo insists that painting is a scienza, grounded not in abstract geometry alone, but in the empirical investigation of natural phenomena. Vision, for Leonardo, is not a stable or transparent medium. It is a process conditioned by light, atmosphere, and the physiology of the eye. His studies of optics, recorded in manuscripts such as the Codex Atlanticus and the Codex Leicester, examine the diffusion of light, the gradation of shadow, and the effects of distance on clarity. These observations are not ancillary to his paintings. They structure them. As Martin Kemp has argued, Leonardo's practice operates through what he terms visual science, in which the act of painting becomes inseparable from the act of inquiry. The image does not present a fixed world. It stages the conditions under which the world becomes visible. This epistemological orientation aligns Leonardo with broader developments in Renaissance natural philosophy, in which observation and experiment begin to supplement, and at times challenge, inherited authorities. The emphasis on experience, esperienza, as a source of knowledge, situates Leonardo within a tradition that anticipates later scientific methodologies, even as it remains embedded in the intellectual frameworks of his time. The instability of vision that emerges in his paintings, most notably in the Mona Lisa, is not merely a stylistic effect, but the consequence of a sustained engagement with the limits of perception. The technique of sfumato, often described in purely formal terms, corresponds to an understanding of how the eye processes visual information, particularly in peripheral vision. Edges dissolve, not because the artist lacks precision, but because precision itself is understood as contingent. The painting becomes a site in which the variability of perception is rendered visible. In contrast, Michelangelo's practice is oriented not toward the analysis of perception, but toward the assertion of form. His engagement with disegno, articulated both in his drawings and in his sculptural work, reflects a conception of artistic activity in which the idea precedes its material realization. The Neoplatonic context in which Michelangelo operates, particularly through the intellectual environment associated with Marsilio Ficino, provides a framework in which the visible world is understood as a manifestation of higher ideal forms. The artist's task is therefore not to replicate appearances, but to reveal the form that underlies them. As David Summers has argued, Michelangelo's work embodies a language of art in which the human body functions as a primary vehicle for expressing this relationship between the material and the ideal. The notion that the figure exists within the block of marble prior to its extraction, frequently attributed to Michelangelo, is not simply a metaphor. It reflects a philosophical position concerning the nature of artistic creation. The process of carving becomes an act of revelation, in which the artist removes what is superfluous in order to disclose what is already present. The unfinished works, often described under the term non finito, make this process visible, exposing the tension between form and matter, rather than resolving it. Michael Baxandall's emphasis on the period eye provides a useful corrective here, reminding us that the perception of such works is conditioned by contemporary habits of seeing, including the ability to recognize the significance of incompleteness as an index of artistic intention. Michelangelo's genius, within this framework, is not located in technical perfection, but in the capacity to articulate a conception of form that exceeds the constraints of material realization. Raphael's practice, by contrast, is defined by the integration of multiple systems into a coherent whole. His engagement with the works of Leonardo and Michelangelo is not imitative, but synthetic, producing compositions in which the complexities introduced by earlier developments are resolved into forms that appear stable and intelligible. Heinrich Wilfelin's distinction between linear and painterly modes, while developed in a later context, provides a useful lens through which to understand Raphael's emphasis on clarity, proportion, and balance. The figures in works such as the School of Athens are arranged within a perspectival system that organizes both space and meaning, aligning intellectual relationships with spatial positioning. The painting functions as a visual argument, in which philosophical ideas are rendered through the distribution of bodies within an architectural framework. Raphael's clarity should not be understood as a simplification, but as a form of control. The viewer's perception is guided through compositional devices that minimize ambiguity, producing an experience in which the act of seeing appears effortless. This apparent ease is the result of careful coordination, in which each element of the image contributes to the intelligibility of the whole. Erwin Panofsky's analysis of perspective as a symbolic form is relevant here, insofar as it highlights the extent to which the construction of space reflects a broader conception of order. In Raphael, this order is not only spatial, but intellectual, presenting a world in which knowledge appears unified and accessible. Donatello's contribution complicates the distinction between painting and sculpture that underlies much Renaissance theory. His development of sciacciato relief introduces a mode of representation that operates at the threshold between surface and depth, producing the illusion of space through minimal variation in the plane. This technique challenges the assumption that sculpture is defined by volume, demonstrating that it can engage with pictorial concerns without relinquishing its material specificity. Donatello's work participates in the broader Renaissance project of recovering classical forms, but it does so through a process of reinterpretation rather than replication. The human figure in his sculptures is neither an abstract ideal nor a purely naturalistic representation. It is a site in which different conceptions of form intersect. The expansion of this field beyond the Italian context further complicates any attempt to define a singular model of artistic thinking. In the work of Albrecht Dürer, for example, the engagement with Italian theories of proportion and perspective is combined with a northern emphasis on empirical observation and surface detail. Dürer's treatises on measurement and proportion reflect an effort to systematize artistic practice, aligning it with mathematical principles, while his drawings and prints demonstrate a sustained attention to the particularities of the natural world. Joseph Kerner has argued that Dürer's self-portraiture contributes to the construction of artistic identity, positioning the artist as both subject and object of representation. This reflexivity underscores the extent to which the category of the artist is being actively negotiated during this period. The diversity of these approaches suggests that the Renaissance should not be understood as a unified movement toward naturalism or idealization, but as a field in which multiple epistemologies of art coexist and interact. Svetlana Alper's distinction between Italian and Northern modes of representation, while subject to critique, remains useful in highlighting the difference between a model that constructs space through geometric abstraction and one that constructs reality through the accumulation of visual detail. These differences are not merely stylistic, they reflect distinct assumptions about the relationship between seeing and knowing, between image and world. The category of genius, when applied to this context, functions as a mechanism for organizing this diversity, attributing coherence to a set of practices that are in fact divergent. It allows for the identification of certain figures as exemplary, but it also risks obscuring the conditions under which their work is produced. The emphasis on individual achievement can conceal the role of workshops, patrons, and institutions, as well as the extent to which artistic practice is shaped by collective traditions and shared problems. As T.J. Clarke has argued, the interpretation of art must account for the social and ideological structures within which it is embedded, rather than treating it as the expression of isolated individuals. To approach the Renaissance through models of artistic thinking is therefore to resist the reduction of its complexity to a single narrative. It is to recognize that the works associated with its most prominent figures are not simply the result of exceptional talent, but the manifestation of different ways of engaging with the problems of representation. These models, observation, creation, harmony, and others, do not define fixed categories, but provide a framework through which the diversity of Renaissance practice can be understood. The artist in this context is not a unified figure, but a site of negotiation in which competing conceptions of art, knowledge, and perception are articulated and contested. As we proceed, these models will serve as points of orientation rather than as definitive classifications, allowing us to examine how individual artists position themselves within a broader field of inquiry. The names that structure our understanding of the Renaissance will be approached not as self-evident markers of greatness, but as nodes within a network of relations, each defined by the ways in which it engages with the fundamental problems of the image. To understand these artists is therefore to understand not only what they produce, but how they think, and how their thinking contributes to the ongoing construction of art as a domain of knowledge. If the Renaissance produces multiple models of artistic thinking, the category of observation emerges as one of its most decisive and theoretically complex formations, not because it privileges looking over invention, but because it redefines seeing as a structured and historically contingent mode of knowledge. Observation, in this context, is not passive reception. It is an active procedure that requires discipline, calibration, and translation. The visible world is not given in a transparent form. It must be interrogated through systems that mediate between perception and representation. The practices of Leonardo da Vinci and Albrecht Dürer articulate this model with particular intensity, yet they do so through distinct epistemological commitments. Their works reveal that observation is neither unified nor neutral. It is shaped by material conditions, intellectual traditions, and the intended circulation of images. The contrast between Leonardo's notebooks and Dürer's engravings is therefore not a secondary distinction. It marks a fundamental divergence in how visual knowledge is produced, stabilized, and transmitted. Leonardo da Vinci, born in 1452 in Vinci near Florence, emerges from the workshop system of early Renaissance Italy, where he trains under Andrea del Verrocchio, a master whose studio integrates painting, sculpture, and engineering. This environment exposes Leonardo to a multidisciplinary approach that profoundly shapes his intellectual formation. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Leonardo's career is marked by mobility rather than long-term attachment to a single workshop or patron. He works in Florence, Milan, under Ludovico Sforza, later in Rome, and ultimately in France under the patronage of Francis I. His notebooks, which number in the thousands of pages, reveal an expansive curiosity that extends beyond painting into anatomy, hydraulics, mechanics, and optics. This breadth of inquiry situates him within a transitional moment in early modern thought, where empirical observation begins to challenge scholastic authority. Leonardo's artistic production cannot be separated from this intellectual context. His paintings are relatively few, yet his influence is disproportionately large, precisely because his work redefines what it means for an artist to know. Leonardo's conception of painting as a science must be understood within the broader reconfiguration of knowledge. in the late 15th century, where empirical inquiry begins to challenge inherited authorities without fully displacing them. His writings consistently assert that painting surpasses poetry and other arts because it engages directly with vision, which he considers the most authoritative of the senses. This claim, however, does not elevate sight as a transparent medium. It introduces a problem. Vision is reliable only insofar as its mechanisms are understood. Leonardo's extensive investigations into optics, drawing upon and extending the work of Ibn al-Haytham and later medieval commentators, examine how light travels, how it interacts with surfaces, and how it is received by the eye. He rejects simplified ray theories in favor of more complex models that account for diffusion, reflection, and gradation. The consequence is decisive. The visible world cannot be reduced to stable outlines. It must be understood as a continuum of tonal and atmospheric variations. Martin Kemp has emphasized that Leonardo's approach operates through a synthesis of experiment and visualization, in which drawing functions as both a cognitive and investigative tool. The notebook becomes a laboratory in which visual hypotheses are tested. This process aligns Leonardo with what Lorraine Daston and Peter Galison later describe as the emergence of trained judgment, where observation is neither purely mechanical nor purely subjective, but structured through learned practices of attention. Leonardo's drawings exemplify this condition. They do not simply record appearances. They transform them into analyzable forms, isolating variables such as light direction, anatomical structure, and motion. The implications for painting are profound. The technique of sfumato must be understood as a response to optical theory, rather than as an aesthetic preference. Leonardo's insistence that contours do not exist in nature leads to the dissolution of line as a primary structuring device. Instead, form emerges through gradients of light and shadow. This approach destabilizes the relationship between figure and ground. The boundary is no longer a fixed division, but a zone of transition. George Didi Huberman has argued that such zones produce an image that is fundamentally unstable, one that resists closure and demands sustained engagement. The viewer is not positioned before a completed object, but within a process of perceptual negotiation. The Mona Lisa exemplifies this condition. The ambiguity of the sitter's expression is not a psychological mystery in isolation. It is a structural consequence of how the painting organizes visibility. The mouth, rendered with minimal contrast, appears to shift depending on the viewer's focal point. Peripheral vision and direct focus produce different readings of the same form. Leonardo exploits what contemporary neuroscience would describe as the uneven distribution of visual acuity across the retina. The painting anticipates this physiological insight without formalizing it in modern terms. It demonstrates that perception is not uniform. It varies according to attention, distance, and movement. Leonardo's engagement with temporality further complicates the model of observation. In The Last Supper, the perspectival system provides a stable framework, yet the distribution of gestures introduces a temporal sequence that cannot be reduced to a single moment. The apostles respond to Christ's announcement with varying degrees of intensity, producing a cascade of reactions that unfold across the composition. Leo Steinberg has shown that the painting integrates multiple theological moments, including the institution of the Eucharist and the announcement of betrayal, within a single visual field. Observation here is not limited to spatial relations. It encompasses the perception of time, requiring the viewer to move across the image in order to assemble its meaning. Leonardo's anatomical studies extend observation into the domain of internal structure. His dissections, conducted in collaboration with medical practitioners, produce drawings that are unprecedented in their analytical depth. Muscles are shown in layers, bones are articulated in relation to movement, and organs are examined in cross-section. Jonathan Saudet has argued that such images participate in a broader Renaissance culture of dissection, where the interior of the body becomes a site of knowledge production. Leonardo's contribution lies in his ability to translate this knowledge into visual form, without separating analysis from representation. The drawing remains both descriptive and interpretive. It reveals processes rather than simply depicting surfaces. Albrecht Dürer, born in 1471 in Nuremberg, develops within a markedly different cultural and economic context, shaped by the urban networks of the Holy Roman Empire. The son of a goldsmith, Dürer receives early training in metalwork before entering the workshop of Michael Wohlgemuth, where he is exposed to both painting and printmaking. His career is defined by mobility and intellectual ambition, including travels to Italy, where he encounters the theories of proportion and perspective developed by artists such as Piero della Francesca and Leonardo. Unlike Leonardo, whose knowledge remains largely within manuscript form, Dürer actively publishes his theoretical work, producing treatises on measurement, fortification, and human proportion. His engagement with printmaking allows his images to circulate widely across Europe, positioning him as one of the first artists to operate within an emerging international market for images. Dürer's practice reflects a synthesis of Northern empirical observation and Italian theoretical systems, situating him at a critical intersection in the development of Renaissance art. If Leonardo's notebooks exemplify an open-ended and exploratory model of observation, Dürer's practice represents a different configuration in which observation is systematized and made reproducible. The medium of engraving is central to this transformation. Unlike drawing, which remains unique and subject to revision, engraving produces multiple identical impressions. This capacity for reproduction alters the function of the image. It becomes a vehicle for the dissemination of knowledge across geographic and social boundaries. Dürer's prints circulate widely, contributing to what Elizabeth Eisenstein has described as the broader culture of print that reshapes the transmission of information in early modern Europe. Dürer's theoretical writings further demonstrate his commitment to systematization. His treatise on measurement introduces geometric methods for constructing perspective, while his work on human proportion seeks to establish normative standards based on empirical observation. These texts reflect an ambition to formalize artistic knowledge, aligning it with mathematical principles that can be taught and replicated. Erwin Panofsky interprets this effort as a synthesis of Northern empiricism and Italian rationalism, producing a model in which observations is disciplined through calculation. Yet Dürer's engravings reveal the limits of this system. Melancholia 1 presents a composition in which instruments of measurement are prominently displayed, yet fail to produce coherence. The polyhedron, the compass, and the scales suggest a world governed by geometry, but the overall image resists resolution. The spatial relationships are ambiguous, and the symbolic elements remain open to multiple interpretations. Joseph Koerner reads this work as an allegory of intellectual frustration, where the pursuit of knowledge encounters its own boundaries. Observation, in this context, does not culminate in clarity. It exposes the insufficiency of the tools designed to produce it. Dürer's 4 books on human proportion further illustrate this tension. While the text attempts to codify ideal forms, it also acknowledges variability within the human body. Multiple proportional schemes are presented, each derived from different observations. The notion of a single ideal is replaced by a range of possibilities. This multiplicity undermines the very system it seeks to establish. As Martin J. has argued in his analysis of visual regimes, early modern theories of vision are characterized by competing models that cannot be fully reconciled. Dürer's work embodies this condition, oscillating between system and contingency. The contrast between Leonardo and Dürer can therefore be understood as a contrast between 2 epistemologies of observation. Leonardo's model emphasizes process, variability, and the open-ended nature of inquiry. His notebooks resist closure, presenting knowledge as provisional and subject to revision. Dürer's model emphasizes structure, reproducibility, and dissemination. His engravings and treatises seek to stabilize knowledge, making it accessible and transferable. Both approaches redefine artistic practice as a form of intellectual activity, yet they do so through different strategies. Material conditions play a decisive role in shaping these strategies. The flexibility of drawing allows Leonardo to explore multiple possibilities within a single sheet. The permanence of engraving requires Dürer to finalize his decisions before execution. These differences are not merely technical. They influence how each artist conceives the relationship between observation and representation. Leonardo's line remains tentative, open to alteration. Dürer's line is definitive, inscribed into the plate with precision. The medium becomes an extension of thought, structuring the translation of perception into form. The expansion beyond Italy introduced by Dürer complicates any attempt to define the Renaissance as a unified phenomenon. The northern emphasis on surface detail, material specificity, and the reproducibility of images introduces a different set of priorities. Svetlana Alpers characterizes this approach as descriptive rather than narrative, emphasizing the registration of visual information over the construction of spatial systems. While this distinction has been debated, it highlights the divergence between a model that seeks to organize the world through geometry and one that seeks to record it through accumulation. The inclusion of Dürer also foregrounds the role of print culture in shaping artistic practice. The circulation of engravings creates new audiences and new contexts for interpretation. Images are no longer confined to specific locations. They can be collected, studied, and compared across regions. This mobility alters the relationship between artist and viewer, introducing a form of engagement that is less tied to physical presence and more dependent on reproduction. Observation, as articulated by Leonardo and Dürer, therefore reveals both the potential and the limits of Renaissance artistic inquiry. It demonstrates that the visible world can be subjected to systematic study, yet it also shows that such study cannot fully stabilize its object. The processes that produce visibility introduce variables that resist complete control. The image becomes a site where knowledge is pursued but never finalized. This instability does not represent a failure of observation. It constitutes its defining condition. The act of seeing, once understood as immediate, is revealed to be mediated, variable, and contingent. The Renaissance artist, in this model, is not simply a recorder of appearances. He is an investigator of the conditions under which appearances emerge. Leonardo and Dürer articulate this investigation through different means, yet both demonstrate that observation transforms painting from a craft into a domain of knowledge. As the inquiry moves forward, the emphasis shifts from the analysis of visibility to the assertion of form. The instability identified here does not disappear. It is reconfigured within a different set of problems, where the resistance of material replaces the variability of perception. In the works of Michelangelo and Donatello, the question of knowledge is no longer how the world is seen, but how form is brought into existence through the act of making. If the model of observation articulated by Leonardo and Dürer situates artistic practice within the analysis of visibility, the model of creation shifts the problem toward the emergence of form through material. The question is no longer how the world appears to the eye, but how form comes into being through the act of making. In this context, the artist does not begin with the instability of perception, but with the resistance of substance. Marble, bronze, and stone impose conditions that cannot be bypassed through optical adjustment. They must be engaged directly. The works of Michelangelo and Donatello define this model with particular intensity, not because they abandon the intellectual ambitions of Renaissance art, but because they reconfigure them around the relationship between idea and matter. Creation, in this sense, is not the production of an image that corresponds to an external reality. It is the process through which form is realized within and against the constraints of material. Michelangelo Buonarroti, born in 1475 in Caprice and raised in Florence, emerges within a cultural environment shaped by Medici patronage, humanist scholarship, and the revival of classical antiquity. He is trained initially in the workshop of Domenico Ghirlandaio, where he acquires foundational skills in drawing and fresco, before entering the informal academy of Lorenzo de' Medici. There, he encounters classical sculpture and Neoplatonic philosophy, particularly through figures associated with Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola. This intellectual formation is decisive, situating Michelangelo at the intersection of artistic practice and philosophical inquiry. His career unfolds across Florence, Rome, and other centers of power, where he works for patrons including the Medici family and multiple popes, notably Julius II and Leo X. Unlike many artists who remain tied to a workshop system, Michelangelo cultivates an identity defined by autonomy and intellectual authority, reinforced through his correspondence and poetry. His output spans sculpture, painting, and architecture, yet his reputation is anchored in his treatment of the human body and his ability to articulate form through material. His practice reflects a sustained engagement with the relationship between ideal conception and physical realization, positioning him as a central figure in the transformation of the artist into an intellectual agent. The theoretical foundation for this model can be traced to the centrality of disegno in Renaissance discourse. Disegno does not refer merely to drawing as a preparatory practice. It designates the conceptual structure that precedes and governs the execution of the work. Giorgio Vasari later elevates disegno as the foundation of all the arts, aligning it with intellect and invention. Yet in the work of Michelangelo, disegno is not simply a plan imposed upon inert matter. It is engaged in a continuous negotiation with the material itself. The block of marble is not a neutral substrate. It possesses density, grain, and resistance. These properties do not merely limit the realization of form, they shape it. Michelangelo's frequently cited assertion that the figure already exists within the stone must be understood as a philosophical proposition rather than a literal claim. It reflects a conception of form derived in part from Neoplatonic thought, particularly the idea that material objects participate in higher ideal forms that precede their manifestation. Marsilio Ficino's translations and commentaries on Plato provide a context in which the visible world is understood as an imperfect reflection of intelligible reality. Within this framework, the artist's task is not to invent form arbitrarily, but to recognize and release it. Creation becomes an act of uncovering rather than fabrication. This conception is made visible in Michelangelo's sculptural practice, where the process of carving is often left partially exposed. The unfinished figures, known as the slaves or prisoners, demonstrate this condition with particular clarity. Portions of the body emerge from the marble with anatomical precision, while other areas remain embedded within the rough surface of the block. The contrast between finished and unfinished zones does not simply indicate an incomplete work. It stages the process of creation itself. Form appears as something that struggles to detach itself from matter, suggesting that the act of making is inseparable from the resistance it encounters. David Summers has argued that Michelangelo's work articulates a language in which the human body becomes the primary site for negotiating the relationship between the ideal and the material. The body is not merely represented. It is produced through a process that reveals the tension between conception and execution. The notion of non finito must therefore be understood not as a failure to complete, but as a deliberate exposure of the conditions under which completion would occur. The unfinished surface resists the illusion of total control. It acknowledges that the realization of form is always partial, always contingent upon material constraints. Georges Didi Huberman has interpreted such works as instances of an image that refuses closure, one that remains open to the viewer's interpretation precisely because it does not resolve the tension it presents. The viewer is not confronted with a finished object, but with a process that continues to unfold. Michelangelo's engagement with the human body further reinforces this model of creation. His figures are not derived from direct observation alone. They are constructed through an intensified understanding of anatomy that transforms the body into a vehicle for expressing force, tension, and a movement. Muscles are exaggerated, proportions are adjusted, and poses are extended beyond natural limits. This is not a departure from knowledge. It is a reconfiguration of it. The body becomes a site where the internal structure of form is made visible through external articulation. As Michael Baxendale has noted, the perception of such figures depends upon a cultivated eye, one that recognizes the significance of these distortions within the context of Renaissance visual culture. The viewer must understand that the body is not being copied from nature, but constructed according to principles that exceed it. Donato di Niccolò di Bettobardi, known as Donatello, is born around 1386 in Florence and develops within the early phase of the Renaissance, when the recovery of classical antiquity intersects with new approaches to naturalism and spatial representation. He trains in the workshop of Lorenzo Ghiberti, contributing to the bronze doors of the Florence Baptistery, where he gains technical experience in casting and relief. His career is closely tied to civic and ecclesiastical commissions in Florence, as well as to patronage networks associated with the Medici family. Donatello's travels to Rome expose him to ancient sculpture, influencing his approach to the human figure and to proportion. Unlike later artists, who emphasize theoretical discourse, Donatello's innovation emerges through practice, particularly in his exploration of relief and the relationship between sculpture and architecture. His works range from freestanding statues to shallow reliefs, each demonstrating a sensitivity to context and viewing conditions. He plays a foundational role in redefining sculpture as a medium capable of both physical presence and optical illusion, establishing principles that later artists, including Michelangelo, will transform and intensify. In contrast to Michelangelo's emphasis on the extraction of form from stone, Donatello's practice introduces a different approach to material and creation. His work does not foreground the struggle between form and matter in the same way. Instead, it explores how form can be articulated across different degrees of depth and surface. The development of schiacciato relief represents a crucial innovation in this regard. By reducing depth to minimal variations in the surface, Donatello creates the illusion of space without relying on the full volume of sculpture. The distinction between sculpture and painting becomes unstable. The surface begins to function as a field in which space is suggested, rather than physically constructed. Donatello's reliefs, particularly those produced for architectural settings, demonstrate an acute awareness of how images are encountered in specific contexts. The viewer's position, the angle of light, and the surrounding environment all contribute to the perception of the work. Creation, in this sense, is not limited to the object itself. It extends to the conditions under which the object is seen. The material is not only shaped, it is activated through its interaction with space and light. Michael Cole has argued that Donatello's work anticipates later developments in the understanding of sculpture as a medium that engages with perception rather than simply occupying space. The relief becomes a site where the boundaries between representation and physical presence are negotiated. The contrast between Michelangelo and Donatello can therefore be understood as a contrast between two approaches to creation. Michelangelo emphasizes the emergence of form through the removal of material, foregrounding the resistance of the block and the intensity of the act of carving. Donatello emphasizes the articulation of form across a surface, exploring how minimal intervention can produce complex visual effects. Both approaches redefine the relationship between artist and material, demonstrating that creation is not the imposition of a pre-existing idea, but a process that unfolds through interaction with substance. This interaction has significant implications for the status of the artist. In the model of observation, the artist derives authority from the ability to analyze and represent the visible world. In the model of creation, authority is grounded in the capacity to transform material into form. The artist becomes a figure who operates at the threshold between idea and substance, capable of mediating between what is conceived and what can be realized. This mediation is not neutral. It involves decisions, adjustments, and compromises that shape the final work. The role of patronage further complicates this process. Michelangelo's commissions, particularly those associated with the Medici family and the papal court, impose conditions that influence both the scale and the content of his work. The Medici Chapel, for example, integrates sculpture, architecture, and symbolic programs into a unified environment that reflects the political and intellectual ambitions of its patrons. Creation, in this context, is not solely an individual act. It is embedded within a network of expectations and constraints. Francis Haskell has demonstrated that the reception of such works cannot be separated from the conditions under which they are commissioned and displayed. The meaning of the sculpture is shaped not only by its form, but by its location and function. Donatello's work similarly operates within specific institutional contexts, including civic and religious commissions that define the role of sculpture within public space. His statue of David, produced in bronze, introduces a new conception of the freestanding nude figure that engages with classical precedents, while redefining their significance within a Christian context. The material properties of bronze allow for a different treatment of surface and detail than marble, producing a work that emphasizes fluidity and refinement, rather than the tension associated with carving. Creation here involves not only the manipulation of form, but the selection and understanding of material, each of which carries its own possibilities and limitations. The theoretical implications of these practices extend beyond the individual works. The model of creation, articulated by Michelangelo and Donatello, challenges the assumption that artistic production can be fully understood through reference to external reality. It suggests that form is not simply derived from observation, but constructed through processes that engage with material, context, and conceptual frameworks. The image, whether sculptural or pictorial, becomes a site where these processes are made visible. At the same time, this model does not eliminate the role of knowledge. It redefines it. Knowledge is no longer confined to the analysis of the visible. It includes an understanding of materials, techniques, and the conditions under which form can be realized. The artist's expertise lies in the ability to navigate these conditions, to anticipate the behavior of materials, and to adjust the process of making accordingly. This expertise is both intellectual and practical, resisting the distinction between thinking and doing that underlies much Renaissance theory. The tension between idea and material that defines this model of creation remains unresolved. It cannot be resolved because it constitutes the very condition of artistic practice. The ideal form cannot be fully realized without encountering the limitations of matter, and material cannot be shaped without reference to an idea that guides its transformation. The work of Michelangelo and Donatello makes this tension visible, demonstrating that creation is not the elimination of resistance, but its engagement. As the discussion moves forward, the emphasis will shift once again from the emergence of form to its organization within a coherent system. The problem is no longer how form is brought into being, but how it is arranged in relation to other forms, in a way that produces clarity and intelligibility. In the works of Raphael and Piero della Francesca, the complexities introduced by observation and creation will be integrated into a model of harmony, where geometry and proportion serve as the basis for constructing a world that appears ordered and complete. If the model of creation articulated by Michelangelo and Donatello situates artistic thinking within the tension between idea and material, the model of harmony reconfigures this tension by subordinating it to order. The central problem is no longer how form emerges from resistant substances, nor how perception destabilizes representation, but how multiplicity can be organized into intelligibility. Harmony is not a passive equilibrium or decorative balance. It is a constructed condition, achieved through the coordination of geometry, proportion, light, and the distribution of figures. In this model, the image presents itself as resolved in advance. The viewer encounters not the struggle of making or the uncertainty of seeing, but a system in which these conditions have already been absorbed and stabilized. The works of Raphael and Piero della Francesca articulate this model with particular rigor, not because they eliminate complexity, but because they reorganize it into a form that appears coherent, rational, and complete. Piero della Francesca, born around 1415 in Borgo San Sepolcro in Tuscany, occupies a singular position within 15th century Italian art because his career develops at the intersection of painting, mathematics, and humanist inquiry. Trained initially within a regional workshop context, and later associated with broader artistic centres such as Florence, Ferrara, and Urbino, Piero works for courts and patrons, whose interests extend beyond devotional representation into questions of geometry, proportion, and intellectual order. His ties to Urbino are especially important, as the court of Federico da Montefeltro fosters an environment in which mathematics, architecture, classical learning, and the visual arts are closely aligned. Unlike artists whose reputations are built primarily upon dramatic narrative or expressive intensity, Piero's importance lies in the precision with which he systematizes pictorial space, and in the extent to which he integrates painting with mathematical reasoning. His surviving treatises on perspective and geometry reveal that his visual practice cannot be separated from theoretical inquiry. He is therefore not only a painter working with mathematical ideas, but an artist whose entire conception of representation is shaped by the conviction that the visible world can be organized through number, proportion, and demonstrable relation. The theoretical foundation of this model lies in the Renaissance reconfiguration of mathematics as a structuring principle of visual representation. Geometry is not treated as an auxiliary tool. It becomes the basis through which the visible world is understood and constructed. Piero della Francesca stands at the center of this transformation. His writings reveal a sustained commitment to articulating painting as a discipline grounded in mathematical reasoning. In his treatise on perspective, he extends earlier formulations by systematizing the projection of three-dimensional space onto a two-dimensional plane with unprecedented precision. Perspective, in this framework, is not merely a technique for creating depth. It is a method for establishing relationships between all elements within the image, according to measurable laws. This mathematical orientation is inseparable from broader intellectual developments in the 15th century, particularly the revival of Euclidean geometry and the integration of mathematical knowledge into humanist education. Piero's work reflects an understanding of proportion, not as an aesthetic preference, but as a principle of order that governs both the visible world and its representation. The image becomes a structured field in which each element occupies a position determined by its relation to others. This relational system produces a form of coherence that is both visual and conceptual. Piero's paintings demonstrate this commitment with a level of rigor that distinguishes his work from that of his contemporaries. In the Flagellation of Christ, the composition is divided into spatial zones that operate according to a precise geometric logic. The architectural interior recedes according to perspectival construction, while the foreground figures occupy a separate, yet proportionally related space. The relationship between these zones is not resolved through narrative continuity. It is established through proportional alignment. Carlo Ginzburg has argued that this structure demands a form of viewing that is analytical rather than immediate, requiring the viewer to recognize relationships that are not explicitly explained. The painting resists a single, unified reading. It presents a system that must be interpreted. The treatment of light in Piero's work reinforces this structural clarity. Illumination is consistent, shadows are sharply defined, and forms are articulated with precision. Light does not introduce variability or ambiguity. It serves to clarify the relationship between volumes and space. The interaction between light and surface is subordinated to the logic of the composition. This approach contrasts sharply with Leonardo's treatment of light as a variable and contingent phenomenon. In Piero, light functions as a stabilizing force, ensuring that the image remains intelligible. The human figure participates in this system of order. Bodies are constructed according to proportional relationships that align them with the spatial framework. Movement is restrained, gestures are measured, and expressions are controlled. The figure does not disrupt the coherence of the image. It reinforces it. Michael Baxandall has emphasized that such figures reflect a cultural environment in which mathematical proportion and rational organization are central to visual experience. The viewer is expected to recognize and appreciate these relationships, engaging with the image as a structured field rather than as a spontaneous representation. Piero's engagement with geometry extends beyond perspective into the study of solid forms. His work on regular polyhedra reflects a broader Renaissance interest in the relationship between mathematical structure and the organization of the cosmos. The image in this context is not merely a representation of visible reality. It is an expression of underlying order. The alignment between geometry and painting situates Piero within a philosophical tradition that links mathematical knowledge to truth. Harmony becomes an epistemological condition, one that reflects the intelligibility of the world itself. Raphael, born Raffaello Sanzio in Urbino in 1483, enters the Renaissance artistic world from a courtly environment, already shaped by refined humanist culture, diplomatic exchange, and an awareness of artistic prestige. His father, Giovanni Santi, is himself a painter and poet attached to the ducal court, which provides Raphael with early exposure not only to workshop practice, but to a cultivated intellectual milieu in which painting is already closely linked to literary and philosophical discourse. After his father's death, Raphael's training continues within workshop structures that likely include contact with Perugino, whose compositional clarity and measured spatial organization leave a strong mark on Raphael's early work. His subsequent movements through Perugia, Florence, and Rome position him within the principal centers of artistic innovation. In Florence, he studies the works of Leonardo and Michelangelo with extraordinary attentiveness, absorbing their achievements while refusing to be subsumed by either. In Rome, under papal patronage, particularly that of Julius II and Leo X, Raphael's career expands rapidly in both scale and ambition. He becomes not only a painter of altarpieces and frescoes, but also an architect, designer, and organizer of large workshop enterprises. His life background is therefore crucial to understanding his art. He is formed at the juncture of court culture, workshop training, papal power, and direct confrontation with the most formidable artistic models of his time. His achievement lies not merely in technical skill, but in his capacity to synthesize disparate visual systems into a mode of painting defined by lucidity, order, and control. Raphael inherits this model of harmony, but transforms it by integrating structure with narrative and human interaction. His work demonstrates that geometric order can be extended beyond the organization of space to include the coordination of figures, gestures, and ideas. The School of Athens represents the most comprehensive articulation of this synthesis. The architectural setting, constructed through linear perspective, establishes a stable spatial framework. The vanishing point, positioned between Plato and Aristotle, aligns geometric order with philosophical centrality. Space becomes a medium through which intellectual relationships are organized. The distribution of figures within this space reflects a complex system of correspondences. Groups form around gestures, dialogues, and shared activities, creating clusters that function simultaneously as spatial arrangements and conceptual units. The clarity of the composition allows these relationships to be perceived without confusion. Each figure occupies a defined position, and each interaction unfolds within a space that supports its legibility. The painting operates as a visual system in which knowledge is arranged in a structured and accessible form. Erwin Panofsky's concept of perspective as a symbolic form provides a critical framework for understanding this development. Perspective is not simply a technical device. It reflects a broader conception of the world as ordered, rational, and accessible to human understanding. In Raphael's work, this symbolic dimension extends to the organization of intellectual life. The School of Athens presents philosophy as a coherent system in which different branches of knowledge are integrated within a unified structure. The painting does not merely depict thinkers. It constructs a visual model of thought itself. Raphael's clarity is not the result of simplification. It is the product of coordination. His engagement with Leonardo and Michelangelo provides access to two distinct models of artistic thinking, one grounded in perceptual investigation and the other in the assertion of form. Raphael does not choose between them. He integrates them within a framework that prioritizes intelligibility. The perceptual ambiguity present in Leonardo is reduced, and the tension present in Michelangelo is moderated. The result is an image that appears balanced and complete. This synthesis is evident in Raphael's Madonnas, where geometric structure and naturalistic representation are combined with a sense of ease that conceals the complexity of their construction. The triangular composition of the Madonna of the Meadow provides a stable framework, while the surrounding landscape recedes in a controlled and coherent manner. The figures are integrated into their environment without losing their clarity. The viewer is not required to navigate uncertainty. The image presents itself as immediately comprehensible. The concept of harmony in Raphael's work extends beyond visual arrangement to encompass the relationship between painting and knowledge. His compositions function as visual arguments, presenting ideas in a form that can be grasped without difficulty. This aligns with humanist concerns regarding the organization and transmission of knowledge. The clarity of the image reflects a desire to present the world as ordered and intelligible. The painting becomes a medium through which the knowledge is communicated. The role of patronage is central to this process. Raphael's major commissions, particularly those associated with the Vatican, are embedded within institutional frameworks that shape their meaning. The stanza della Segnatura forms part of a program that aligns classical philosophy with Christian theology. The coherence of the images contributes to this alignment, presenting knowledge as unified under papal authority. Louis Marine's analysis of representation as a function of power is instructive in this context. The image does not merely depict order, it produces it, reinforcing the authority of the institution that frames it. Piero's relationship to patronage operates within a different, but related context. His works are often associated with courts that value mathematical and philosophical inquiry. The clarity and structure of his paintings reflect these intellectual environments. The image becomes a site where abstract principles are translated into visual form. The relationship between art and knowledge is mediated through structure rather than narrative. The model of harmony also redefines the role of the viewer, in contrast to the model of observation, where the viewer must negotiate perceptual instability, or the model of creation, where the viewer encounters the resistance of material. Harmony positions the viewer within a system that has already been resolved. The image anticipates the viewer's gaze, guiding it through compositional devices that minimize ambiguity, the viewer's task is not to construct meaning, but to recognize it. This does not eliminate interpretation. It directs it toward a specific mode of engagement. Michael Baxendall's concept of the period eye remains essential for understanding this dynamic. The ability to perceive harmony depends on culturally specific forms of visual training, including familiarity with geometry, proportion, and rhetorical organization. Renaissance viewers were equipped to recognize the significance of these elements, enabling them to engage with the image as a structured field of knowledge. The clarity of Raphael's work is therefore not universal. It is historically conditioned. The emphasis on harmony introduces limitations as well as achievements. By organizing complexity into a coherent system, it restricts the range of variability that can be expressed within the image. The instability of perception and the resistance of material are contained rather than explored. This containment produces images of remarkable clarity, but it also establishes a framework that can be challenged. The legacy of this model is substantial. Raphael's synthesis becomes a standard against which subsequent artistic developments are measured. His work is institutionalized within academies and theoretical discourse, shaping expectations of artistic excellence. Yet this very success contributes to its destabilization. The clarity and balance that define Raphael's compositions create a system that later artists will question and disrupt. The model of harmony, therefore, represents both a culmination and a point of transition. It demonstrates that the complexities of Renaissance artistic thinking can be organized into a coherent and intelligible form, but it also reveals the constraints of such organization. The image, in achieving clarity, limits its capacity for ambiguity and tension. As the discussion moves forward, this limitation becomes a site of inquiry. In the works of Botticelli and Titian, the emphasis shifts from geometric structure to poetic and sensory experience. The image will no longer present itself as a fully resolved system. It will open into a field in which a meaning emerges through color, atmosphere, and association. Harmony will not disappear. It will be reconfigured, giving way to a mode in which clarity is no longer the primary objective, and the relationship between form and meaning becomes more fluid and less contained. If the model of harmony articulated by Raphael and Piero della Francesca presents painting as a rational system in which geometry stabilizes vision and secures meaning, the emergence of mythological painting in the later 15th and early 16th centuries reconfigures the function of the image by displacing the primacy of geometric intelligibility in favor of poetic indeterminacy. The problem of painting is no longer confined to the construction of a coherent spatial order, or the rendering of bodies according to ideal proportion. It extends into the domain of interpretation, where meaning is generated through association, metaphor, and philosophical reference, rather than through structural clarity alone. In this shift, painting begins to operate not as a transparent window onto a unified world, but as a layered field of signification, in which the visible and the intelligible are held in productive tension. The works of Sandro Botticelli and Titian articulate this transformation with particular force, demonstrating that the Renaissance is not defined by a single trajectory toward rational order, but by the coexistence of multiple, often competing, models of representation. The intellectual context of Botticelli's Florence is essential for understanding the conditions under which mythological painting emerges as a significant category. The circle associated with the Medici court, particularly figures such as Marsilio Ficino and Angelo Poliziano, cultivates a renewed engagement with classical antiquity that is both philological and philosophical. Ficino's translations and commentaries on Plato and Plotinus introduce a Neoplatonic framework in which beauty is understood as a mediating force between the material and the divine. Within this framework, the contemplation of physical beauty is not an end in itself, but a means of ascending toward intellectual and spiritual understanding. Painting, in this context, becomes a vehicle for articulating this ascent, translating abstract philosophical concepts into visual form. Alessandro Botticelli, born Alessandro di Mariano Filippepi, around 1445 in Florence, develops within the intensely competitive and intellectually charged environment of late Quattrocento Florence, where workshop practice, Medici patronage, and humanist culture intersect. He is trained first within the world of artisanal production, and later in the workshop of Fra Filippo Lippi, from whom he acquires a sensitivity to contour, elegance, and linear refinement. His career unfolds under the shadow and support of Florentine elite culture, particularly through associations with members of the Medici circle, whose interest in classical literature, philosophy, and poetic allegory provides a fertile context for the development of mythological painting. Botticelli also works on major ecclesiastical commissions, including frescoes in the Sistine Chapel, demonstrating that his output is not confined to private poetic subjects. Yet his historical position is defined above all by his ability to transform Florentine disegno into a vehicle for symbolic and philosophical complexity. His later years, shaped by the religious upheavals associated with Savonarola, have often been interpreted as a period of spiritual and artistic reorientation, though scholarship remains cautious about over-dramatizing this shift. What remains clear is that Botticelli's life and work are inseparable from the specific cultural world of late 15th century Florence, where painting becomes a site in which poetry, philosophy, and elite self-fashioning converge. Botticelli's The Birth of Venus must be situated within this intellectual environment. The figure of Venus, emerging from the sea and borne toward the shore, is not simply a representation of a mythological narrative derived from classical sources such as Hesiod. It is a constructed image that synthesizes multiple layers of meaning, drawing upon poetic texts, philosophical interpretations, and contemporary humanist discourse. The body of Venus is rendered with an emphasis on contour rather than volumetric modeling, her form defined through line rather than through the modulation of light and shadow. This emphasis on line is not merely stylistic. It reflects a conception of the image in which form is articulated through intellectual design, rather than through optical observation. Abby Warburg's analysis of Botticelli's figures provides a crucial point of entry into this mode of representation. Warburg identifies in Botticelli's treatment of drapery and hair a form of expressive movement that he terms bewegtes Leben, a moving life that animates the surface of the painting. This movement is not governed by naturalistic observation alone. It is informed by the artist's engagement with classical models, particularly those associated with Hellenistic sculpture, in which the dynamic articulation of the body conveys emotional intensity. In Botticelli, this dynamic is translated into line, producing a rhythmic pattern that extends across the surface of the painting. The image is not organized primarily through depth, but through the interplay of contours that guide the viewer's gaze. The spatial structure of The Birth of Venus further reinforces this orientation. The background does not recede into a deep, measurable space, constructed through linear perspective. Instead, it functions as a shallow field against which the figure is presented. The sea, the shoreline, and the surrounding elements are arranged in a manner that supports the central figure, without fully integrating into a coherent spatial system. This lack of perspectival depth does not result in confusion. It produces a different form of coherence, one that prioritizes the clarity of the figure as an idea rather than as an object situated within a defined environment. The image operates as a visual analogue to the Neoplatonic conception of beauty, in which the physical form serves as a conduit for intellectual contemplation. Panofsky's iconological method provides a framework for understanding how meaning is constructed within such images. According to Panofsky, the interpretation of a work of art operates on multiple levels, from the identification of primary subject matter to the analysis of intrinsic meaning within a broader cultural context. In Botticelli's Primavera, These levels are particularly complex. The painting does not correspond to a single narrative source. It synthesizes elements from Ovid's Fasti, Lucretius's De Rerum Natura, and contemporary poetic and philosophical texts. The figures, Venus, Mercury, the three Graces, Flora, Chloris, and Zephyrus, are arranged in a composition that resists linear narrative. Their relationships are symbolic, rather than sequential, requiring the viewer to engage in a process of interpretation that reconstructs meaning through the recognition of references and associations. The composition of Primavera exemplifies a mode of painting in which the surface becomes a site of intellectual activity. Figures are distributed across the picture plane in a manner that emphasizes their individual significance while maintaining a rhythmic continuity. The absence of a unified perspectival system allows for the coexistence of multiple symbolic elements that would be difficult to reconcile within a strictly geometric framework. The viewer is not positioned within a single stable viewpoint. Instead, the viewer's gaze moves across the surface, engaging with each figure in turn and constructing meaning through the accumulation of visual and conceptual information. This mode of engagement aligns with what George D.D. Huberman describes as the image's capacity to sustain contradiction. The image does not resolve the tension between visibility and meaning. It maintains it, producing a space in which interpretation remains open. Botticelli's paintings exemplify this condition. They are not reducible to a single meaning or function. They operate as complex visual texts that require active participation from the viewer. The emphasis on line in Botticelli's work is closely related to the concept of disegno, understood in Renaissance theory as both drawing and intellectual design. In the Florentine context, disegno is often positioned as the foundation of artistic practice, associated with the capacity to conceive and organize form. Botticelli's use of line reflects this conception. The contour does not merely define the boundaries of the figure. It articulates a form of thinking, translating intellectual and symbolic relationships into visual terms. The image becomes a manifestation of an idea rather than a direct transcription of the visible world. If Botticelli's work foregrounds the role of line and symbolic association, Titian's painting reconfigures the poetic dimension of the image through the primacy of color, the materiality of paint, and the instability of perception. The Venetian context in which Titian operates is characterized by a different set of priorities, shaped in part by the widespread use of oil painting as a medium that allows for the subtle modulation of light and color. The theoretical distinction between disegno and color, articulated in Renaissance discourse, provides a framework for understanding this difference. While Florentine artists emphasize line as the basis of form, Venetian painters explore the potential of color as a generative force capable of producing both form and meaning. Titian, born Tiziano Vecellio around 1488 or 1490 in Pieve di Cadore, in the Venetian mainland, develops within the artistic and political orbit of Venice, a city whose maritime wealth, cosmopolitan culture, and deep investment in coloristic painting shape his entire practice. He is sent to Venice at a young age, where he trains first within workshop structures associated with mosaic and painting, and later becomes closely connected with Giovanni Bellini and Giorgione, two foundational figures in the development of Venetian art. Titian's early career unfolds within a context in which collaborative practice and stylistic exchange are common, yet he rapidly distinguishes himself through his command of color, his adaptability across subject types, and his responsiveness to elite patronage. Over the course of his long career, he works not only for Venetian institutions and private collectors, but for some of the most powerful patrons in Europe, including Alfonso d'Este, Charles V, and Philip II of Spain. His output ranges across altarpieces, portraits, poesy, and mythological works, and his reputation, during his lifetime, reflects the emergence of the painter as an internationally recognized and politically significant cultural figure. Titian's life background is therefore crucial to understanding his painting. He is formed not within the civic and linear traditions of Florence, but within a Venetian environment in which colour, atmosphere, and painterly material become central to the visual imagination. Titian's approach to painting demonstrates that form can emerge through the interaction of colour and light, rather than through clearly defined contours. The use of layered glazes allows for the gradual accumulation of tonal variation, creating surfaces that appear to shift under changing conditions of illumination. The boundaries between forms are not sharply delineated. They are modulated, allowing figures to emerge and recede in relation to their surroundings. This approach introduces a degree of perceptual instability, in which the image cannot be fully grasped in a single glance. David Rozan's analysis of Venetian painting emphasizes the significance of this material dimension. In Titian's work, the act of painting becomes visible, drawing attention to the process through which the image is constructed. The viewer encounters not only the depicted subject, but the material conditions of its representation. This emphasis on process aligns with a conception of painting as an experiential medium, one that engages the viewer's perception over time. The concept of poesia, often associated with Titian's mythological works, further clarifies this orientation. These paintings are not intended to convey fixed narratives. They evoke moods, atmospheres, and states of perception that resist precise articulation. In Bacchus and Ariadne, the composition unfolds through a dynamic interplay of movement and colour. The figures are integrated into a landscape that is itself animated by light, producing a sense of continuity between human and natural forms. The image does not guide the viewer toward a single point of focus. It invites movement across the surface, encouraging a mode of engagement that is exploratory rather than directed. The treatment of the body in Titian's work exemplifies this approach. In the Venus of Urbino, the figure is modelled through subtle gradations of light and colour, rather than through sharply defined contours. The surface of the skin appears luminous, its form emerging from the surrounding environment. The viewer's gaze is drawn to the interplay between figure and ground, where distinctions are maintained yet softened. This ambiguity produces a sense of presence that is both immediate and elusive, reinforcing the experiential dimension of the image. Svetlana Olper's concept of the image as a surface of attention provides a useful framework for understanding this mode of painting. Although her analysis focuses primarily on Northern art, the emphasis on surface and the rejection of a single, unified spatial system resonate with aspects of Venetian practice. In Titian's work, the surface of the painting becomes a site of visual engagement, where meaning is constructed through the interaction of colour, light, and material. The role of patronage in shaping Titian's mythological paintings is also significant. These works are often produced for private collections, where they are encountered in intimate settings, rather than in public or liturgical contexts. The viewer engages with the image over time, exploring its details and responding to its sensory qualities. This context allows for a mode of painting that emphasizes sensuality and ambiguity, encouraging a form of attention that is sustained and reflective. The contrast between Botticelli and Titian reveals two distinct yet related approaches to the poetic dimension of painting. Botticelli's work operates through line and symbolic association, engaging with philosophical and literary traditions. Titian's work operates through colour and materiality, engaging with perception and sensory experience. Both approaches challenge the assumptions of harmony by introducing forms of meaning that cannot be fully stabilized within a single framework. This challenge has significant implications for the role of the viewer. In the model of harmony, the viewer is positioned within a structured system in which meaning is organized and clarified. In the model of poetry and myth, the viewer is required to navigate a field of associations that cannot be fully resolved. Meaning emerges through interaction, through the movement of the gaze, and the recognition of relationships that are not explicitly defined. the viewer becomes an active participant in the construction of meaning. The theoretical implications of this shift extend beyond individual works. They suggest that the Renaissance is not defined solely by the pursuit of clarity and order, but also by the exploration of ambiguity, multiplicity, and the limits of interpretation. Botticelli and Titian demonstrate that painting can function as a medium for articulating these conditions, producing images that are rich in meaning, yet resistant to closure. At the same time, this resistance introduces new tensions. The absence of a unified structural framework challenges the stability that defines earlier models of Renaissance painting. The image becomes less predictable, less easily interpreted. This unpredictability does not diminish its significance. It expands it, opening new possibilities for artistic expression and for the role of the viewer in engaging with the image. As these possibilities develop, they will be further explored and intensified in the works associated with mannerism, where the instability introduced through poetic and sensory approaches becomes a defining feature of the image itself. The transition from harmony to tension, from clarity to ambiguity, marks not a rupture, but a continuation of the Renaissance's engagement with the conditions of representation, demonstrating that the history of painting is shaped as much by the questioning of its principles as by their establishment. The transformation of painting in the decades following the High Renaissance is most clearly understood, not through the abstraction of stylistic labels, but through the sustained and highly specific investigations undertaken by individual artists who confront the apparent completeness of earlier systems and subject them to pressure. Parmigianino, Pontormo, and Bronzino do not operate as passive inheritors of a resolved visual language. They engage that language as a problem whose internal logic can be extended, strained, and reconfigured. The figure, which had functioned as the stable carrier of proportion, clarity, and idealization in the works of Raphael and Leonardo, became unstable. Space, which had been constructed as a coherent system through perspective, becomes inconsistent or deliberately ambiguous. Meaning, which had been organized through compositional hierarchy, becomes dispersed, encoded, or resistant to resolution. The image, in their hands, does not collapse into disorder. It becomes a site in which representation is tested at its limits. Parmigianino, born Girolamo Francesco Maria Mazzola, in Parma in 1503, comes of age in a period when the achievements of the High Renaissance have already established an imposing standard of artistic perfection. Orphaned at a relatively young age, he is raised and trained by relatives who are themselves painters, which places him early within a workshop environment, while also encouraging an unusually precocious artistic development. His reputation grows quickly in Parma and expands further after his move to Rome, where he studies the works of Raphael and Michelangelo at close range and absorbs the visual culture of the papal city, just before the catastrophe of the sack of Rome in 1527. This event disrupted both the political and artistic environment in which he had begun to establish himself, forcing him into a more unstable pattern of movement between Bologna, Parma, and other centres. His career remains comparatively short, ending with his death in 1540. Yet his significance is disproportionate to its duration, because he transforms the inherited language of Renaissance ideality into something more elongated, refined, unstable, and self-conscious. His life background matters, because it places him at a historical juncture where admiration for the classical and the Raphaelesque no longer produces imitation alone, but rather a heightened artifice born from proximity to perfection and the necessity of moving beyond it. Parmigianino's practice is grounded in a continuous interrogation of proportion as a conceptual, rather than merely anatomical system. His engagement with classical models, particularly those associated with Roman sculpture, does not result in imitation, but in transformation. In Madonna, with the long neck, the Virgin's body is extended beyond normative proportion in a manner that is systematic rather than decorative. The elongation of the neck, the extension of the torso, and the refinement of the limbs produce a figure that appears at once elegant and disquieting. The deviation from anatomical plausibility does not obscure the body's structure. It reconfigures the criteria through which that structure is understood. Exergian's analysis of Parmigianino's corpus demonstrates that elongation functions as a consistent principle across both painting and drawing, suggesting that distortion is not an effect applied to finished works, but a generative strategy embedded within the process of invention. The drawn line becomes a site of experimentation, where proportion is tested, extended, and recalibrated. This process reveals a conception of the body not as a fixed entity, but as a variable form capable of transformation. The viewer encounters a figure that cannot be reduced to a stable schema. It demands a mode of looking that is attentive to variation, rather than governed by expectation. The child in Madonna with the long neck further complicates this engagement with proportion. His body is elongated and loosely articulated, lacking the volumetric solidity that characterizes earlier representations of the infant Christ. The pose appears unstable, as though the figure could slip from the Virgin's lap. This instability introduces a tension between physical presence and compositional arrangement. The body is present, yet it resists the conditions that would secure its placement within space. The spatial structure of the painting intensifies this tension. The cluster of figures on the left is compressed into a narrow zone, their bodies overlapping in a manner that resists clear differentiation. Their presence produces a density that contrasts sharply with the open, ambiguous space on the right. This space is punctuated by a small figure and a column that appears disproportionately large. The column does not function as an architectural element that organizes space through perspective. It operates as a vertical interruption, a form that cannot be reconciled with the scale or logic of the surrounding composition. Scherman's interpretation of Parmigianino situates these distortions within a framework of deliberate artifice, arguing that the artist engages with the conventions of Renaissance painting in order to reveal their constructed nature, the elongation of the body, the compression and expansion of space, and the disjunction between elements do not indicate a loss of control. They demonstrate a reorientation of control, one that prioritizes invention over adherence to established norms. The painting asserts its autonomy from the natural world, presenting itself as a constructed object that reflects on its own conditions of possibility. Jacopo Carucci, known as Pontormo, after the town of his birth near Empoli, is born in 1494 and develops within the Florentine environment that had already been shaped by the legacies of Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Andrea del Sarto. Orphaned early and moving through several workshop settings, he receives a varied artistic education that exposes him to multiple masters before he comes under the influence of Andrea del Sarto, whose workshop provides him with a disciplined grounding in drawing, composition, and fresco. Yet, Pontormo's career is marked by a restless and increasingly idiosyncratic departure from the clarity and balance associated with earlier Florentine painting. He works in Florence under Medici patronage and within ecclesiastical contexts, but his surviving drawings, frescoes, and panel paintings reveal an artist whose imagination becomes progressively more inward, experimental, and unstable. Giorgio Vasari, though often uneasy before the more eccentric dimensions of Pontormo's later style, recognizes both his brilliance and his singularity. His life background is important because it situates him within the very center of Florentine artistic tradition, while showing how an artist formed by that tradition can bend it toward a more anxious, suspended, and unresolved visual language. Pontormo's work extends this interrogation of representation into a different register, one in which the instability of the figure is inseparable from the instability of space. In the deposition, from the cross, the removal of a defined ground plane eliminates the spatial framework that would normally anchor the composition. The figures are suspended within a shallow, indeterminate field, their bodies arranged in a configuration that defies gravitational logic. This suspension transforms the relationship between figure and environment, producing a composition in which space does not contain the figures, but is generated through their interaction. The bodies in Pontormo's painting are elongated and twisted, their poses extending beyond natural limits. Yet this distortion is not uniform. Each figure is articulated with a distinct sense of movement, producing a network of gestures that link the composition together. The viewer's eye moves across the painting, following these gestures, constructing relationships that are not defined by spatial hierarchy, but by the flow of movement. The absence of a central focal point reinforces this condition. The composition does not direct the viewer toward a single moment of recognition. It requires continuous engagement. Cropper's analysis of Pontormo emphasizes the role of color in structuring this engagement. The palette, composed of luminous and often dissonant hues, does not correspond to naturalistic observation. It operates as an independent system, organizing the composition through contrasts and transitions that guide the viewer's perception. Color replaces perspective as the primary means of structuring space. The viewer is oriented through chromatic relationships, rather than geometric ones. This chromatic structure introduces a form of visual instability that parallels the distortion of the body. The interaction of colors produces a sense of movement that is not tied to physical action. The painting appears to shift as the viewer's gaze moves across it, producing an experience that unfolds over time. The image cannot be fully apprehended in a single glance. It requires sustained attention. Pontormo's engagement with drawing further clarifies this approach. His preparatory studies reveal a process in which figures are isolated, recombined, and reconfigured, suggesting that the composition is constructed through a series of adjustments, rather than through the application of a predetermined scheme. The final painting retains traces of this process, presenting a configuration that appears both resolved and provisional. The viewer encounters a composition that is coherent yet open, structured yet unstable. Agnolo di Cosimo, known as Bronzino, was born in Florence in 1503 and trained within the orbit of Pontormo, whose influence is decisive in his early development. Unlike Parmigianino, whose career is shaped by displacement, or Pontormo, whose practice often appears psychologically inward and unstable, Bronzino becomes deeply identified with the courtly structures of Medici Florence, especially under Cosimo I de' Medici. His position as court painter gives his work a different social and political inflection, one in which artistic refinement, controlled surface, and symbolic opacity become aligned with aristocratic display and elite intellectual culture. Bronzino is not only a painter, but also a poet, and this literary cultivation is essential to understanding the density and self-conscious sophistication of his images. His career unfolds within an environment where painting operates not merely as devotional or aesthetic practice, but as an instrument of dynastic representation and coded cultural prestige. His life background, therefore, matters because it explains why his art combines extraordinary formal polish with conceptual reserve. He is an artist shaped by court culture, by the demands of elite patronage, and by a Florentine tradition that has become increasingly self-aware of its own artifice. Bronzino's work introduces a different form of complexity, one that operates through precision rather than distortion in the conventional sense. In Allegory, with Venus and Cupid, the figures are rendered with extraordinary clarity, their contours sharply defined, their surfaces polished to a degree that eliminates visible brushwork. This precision does not produce transparency. It produces distance. The figures appear almost artificial, their perfection emphasizing the constructed nature of the image. Liebenstein's analysis situates Bronzino within a courtly context in which images function as vehicles of intellectual and symbolic exchange. The ambiguity of Allegory with Venus and Cupid is not a byproduct of complexity. It is a deliberate condition. The relationships between the figures are encoded, their gestures suggesting meanings that cannot be immediately resolved. The viewer is required to interpret the image, engaging with it as a problem that unfolds over time. The treatment of the body in Bronzino's painting reflects this orientation. The figures are idealized to a degree that removes traces of natural variation. Their surfaces appear smooth and continuous, their forms defined with a precision that recalls sculptural finish. This refinement produces a form of distortion that is distinct from the elongation of Parmigianino or the instability of Pontormo. The body becomes abstracted through perfection, its natural irregularities suppressed in favor of a constructed ideal. The spatial organization of Bronzino's composition further reinforces its conceptual complexity. The figures are arranged within a shallow space that resists clear articulation. The background does not recede into depth. It functions as a surface against which the figures are presented. This compression of space aligns with the emphasis on surface clarity, producing an image that is visually precise, yet spatially ambiguous. The comparison between Parmigianino, Pontormo, and Bronzino reveals that the transformation of painting in this period is not defined by a single approach, but by a set of shared concerns articulated through distinct strategies. Parmigianino destabilizes proportion, extending the body beyond classical limits. Pontormo dissolves spatial coherence, producing compositions in which figures are suspended and interconnected through movement and color. Bronzino refines the image to a degree that intensifies its conceptual opacity, producing surfaces that are clear yet resistant to interpretation. Despite these differences, all three artists engage with the limits of Renaissance representation. The systems that had defined earlier painting are not abandoned. They are tested, perspective is disrupted, proportion is extended, and clarity is complicated. The image becomes a site in which these systems are examined, rather than simply applied. The implications of this transformation extend to the role of the viewer. In the works of Raphael, the viewer is positioned within a system that guides perception toward a unified understanding. In the works of Parmigianino, Pontormo, and Bronzino, this guidance is destabilized. The viewer must navigate a field of visual and conceptual tensions, assembling meaning through sustained engagement. The act of viewing becomes more demanding, requiring attention not only to what is represented, but to how representation is constructed. Recent scholarship has emphasized the importance of approaching these artists through the specificity of their practices. Rather than treating them as representatives of a unified style, studies by scholars such as Elizabeth Cropper, Craig Hugh Smith, and David Exogian have highlighted the ways in which each artist develops a distinct response to the problem of representation. This approach reveals that the transformation of painting in this period is not the result of a single movement, but of multiple, intersecting inquiries. The significance of Parmigianino, Pontormo, and Bronzino lies in their capacity to reveal the limits of Renaissance systems while extending their possibilities. By destabilizing proportion, space, and meaning, they transform painting into a medium capable of engaging with complexity that cannot be resolved through harmony alone. Their works demonstrate that the image can function not only as a system of order, but as a site of tension, where the conditions of representation are continuously examined and redefined. The development of painting in the northern regions of Europe during the 15th and 16th centuries constitutes not a peripheral variation of Renaissance art, but a fundamentally distinct system of visual thinking. While Italian painters formulate a model grounded in linear perspective, anatomical idealization, and the construction of unified pictorial space, artists in the Low Countries pursue a mode of representation rooted in observation, material specificity, and the accumulation of visible detail. This divergence reflects not a difference in technical capacity, but a difference in epistemology, how the visible world is understood and how knowledge is constructed through images. Northern painting does not subordinate vision to geometry. It constructs knowledge through sustained attention to surfaces, objects, and the variability of light. The term Low Countries refers to a geographically and politically complex region in northwestern Europe that includes present-day Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and parts of northern France. During the 15th century, much of this territory fell under Burgundian rule, producing a relatively unified economic and cultural environment that supports artistic production. Cities such as Bruges, Ghent, and Antwerp emerge as major centres of commerce, deeply embedded within international trade networks. This mercantile context shapes artistic patronage in ways that differ from Italian models. While ecclesiastical commissions remain central, there is significant demand for private devotional panels and portraits, works designed for domestic interiors and close viewing. As Craig Harbison has demonstrated, this context fosters a mode of painting that privileges detail, material presence, and prolonged engagement, rather than immediate legibility. Flemish art during the Renaissance develops within this intersection of economic prosperity, devotional practice, and technical innovation. The refinement of oil painting enables artists to render surfaces with unprecedented precision, capturing variations in light, texture, and reflection. This capacity supports a descriptive mode of representation in which objects are not generalized, but differentiated according to their optical properties. As Erwin Panofsky observed, Northern painting operates through a form of microscopic vision, in which the world is explored through incremental observation, rather than abstract systematization. The image becomes a site of inquiry, where knowledge emerges through looking. The Flemish school must be understood as a network of practices rather than a unified doctrine. Artists are connected through guild systems, workshop training, and the circulation of models and techniques. Workshops function as both productive and pedagogical spaces, where knowledge is transmitted across generations and where multiple hands contribute to the making of a single work. This structure complicates modern notions of authorship while enabling a high degree of technical consistency. The Flemish school is therefore not defined by stylistic uniformity, but by shared priorities: attention to surface, mastery of oil painting, and the construction of meaning through visual accumulation. The importance of the Flemish school within the Renaissance lies in its capacity to expand the possibilities of painting beyond the framework established in Italy. It demonstrates that the image can function without reliance on linear perspective as its primary organizing principle. Instead of constructing a unified spatial system, Flemish artists construct a field of visual information in which each element is rendered with equal intensity. This approach influences artistic practices across Europe, contributing to the dissemination of oil painting techniques and offering an alternative model of representation, grounded in observation rather than abstraction. Jan van Eyck, active in the early 15th century and documented until his death in 1441, emerged within the Burgundian Netherlands as one of the most influential painters of his generation. Likely trained in a workshop environment typical of the period, his early formation remains partially undocumented. Yet by the 1420s he is already operating at a level of technical and intellectual sophistication that suggests both access to elite patronage and participation in courtly culture. His appointment as court painter to Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, situates him within one of the most powerful political courts in Europe, where artistic production intersects with diplomacy, ceremony, and the construction of dynastic identity. Archival records indicate that Van Eyck undertook diplomatic missions on behalf of the Duke, including travel to Portugal, revealing the extent to which his role extended beyond that of a conventional artisan. His career exemplifies the transformation of the painter's status within Northern Europe, as artistic skill becomes aligned with intellectual capacity and political utility. Jan van Eyck stands at the centre of this development, not as an isolated innovator, but as a figure who synthesizes and refines existing practices into a highly coherent system. His paintings are characterized by an extraordinary precision in the rendering of surfaces, combined with a complex engagement with symbolic meaning. In the Arnolfini portrait, the domestic interior is constructed through the meticulous articulation of objects, each rendered according to its material properties. The viewer's attention is dispersed across the surface, moving from the reflective chandelier to the convex mirror, which introduces a secondary visual field that complicates the relationship between viewer and image. Vision is not anchored to a single point. It is distributed across the painting. Van Eyck's Ghent altarpiece extends this approach into a monumental format, demonstrating that the accumulation of detail can operate at multiple scales. The central panel, depicting the adoration of the mystic Lamb, presents a landscape populated with figures, architecture, and natural elements rendered with extraordinary precision. The viewer's experience unfolds temporally, requiring sustained attention across multiple zones of the composition. Rogier van der Weyden, born around 1399 in Tournai and active primarily in Brussels until his death in 1464, represents one of the most prominent figures in northern painting after Van Eyck. He trained in the workshop of Robert Campien, a master associated with early developments in oil painting and naturalistic representation. His appointment as official city painter of Brussels marks a significant institutional recognition, situating his work within civic as well as religious contexts. Van der Weyden's paintings achieve wide circulation during his lifetime, aided by workshop production and the replication of his compositions, contributing to his influence across Europe, including in Italy and Spain. His pilgrimage to Rome in the 1450s further indicates his engagement with broader artistic currents, though his work remains firmly rooted in northern traditions of emotional intensity and surface articulation. Rogier van der Weyden develops a distinct approach that emphasizes emotional intensity through the articulation of form and gesture. In the Descent from the Cross, space is compressed, eliminating depth and bringing the figures into immediate proximity with the viewer. The composition is structured through the alignment of bodies, particularly the parallel positioning of Christ and the Virgin, whose shared pose creates a visual and emotional connection. The clarity of contour and the precision of detail produce an image that is both direct and complex, engaging the viewer through empathy rather than through immersion in space. Hieronymus Bosch, born Jeronimus van Eyck in around 1450 in Eshertogenbosch, and active there until his death in 1516, occupies a distinctive position within Northern art, due to the imaginative and often enigmatic nature of his work. He comes from a family of painters, suggesting that his artistic training occurs within a hereditary workshop structure. His association with the Brotherhood of Our Lady, an elite religious confraternity, indicates his integration into a network of patrons and intellectuals engaged in devotional and theological discourse. Despite the relative scarcity of documentary evidence, Bosch's paintings achieved considerable recognition during his lifetime, attracting patrons from across Europe, including members of the Spanish court. His work reflects both local traditions and broader concerns with morality, sin, and the nature of human experience. Hieronymus Bosch introduces a radically different extension of Northern painting, one that expands the field of representation into domains of imagination, moral inquiry, and symbolic excess. In the Garden of Earthly Delights, the surface of the painting becomes densely populated with figures, objects, and hybrid forms that resist integration into a single narrative or spatial framework. The absence of a dominant perspective allows for the coexistence of multiple scenes, each operating according to its own internal logic. The viewer's attention is dispersed across the surface, moving from one detail to another in a process that resembles reading rather than viewing. Peter Bruegel the Elder, born around 1525 and active until his death in 1569, represents a later phase of Northern Renaissance painting in which the focus shifts toward the observation of everyday life and collective human activity. Likely trained in Antwerp, one of the most important commercial and artistic centres of the 16th century, Bruegel entered the Guild of St. Luc in 1551, marking his professional establishment. His travels to Italy expose him to Renaissance art, yet his work does not adopt Italian perspectival systems, instead maintaining a commitment to Northern observational practices. His association with humanist scholars, such as Abraham Ortelius, situates him within an intellectual network concerned with geography, knowledge, and the study of human behavior. His works circulate widely through prints, extending his influence beyond the immediate context of painting. Peter Bruegel, the elder, extends the Northern emphasis on observation into the domain of collective human experience, shifting the focus from symbolic and religious imagery to the depiction of everyday life. In Hunters in the Snow, the composition is structured through a landscape that unfolds across the multiple planes, guiding the viewer's gaze without relying on a strict perspectival system. The figures, engaged in activities such as hunting and skating, are integrated into a broader environment that reflects seasonal change and social interaction. The viewer engages with the painting through exploration, constructing meaning through the accumulation of detail. Across these artists, Northern painting develops a model of representation that prioritizes surface detail and multiplicity over geometric coherence. The image is not constructed as a unified window into a rationally ordered space, but as a field of visual information in which meaning emerges through accumulation. The viewer is not positioned within the image, but engages with it through sustained observation, moving across a surface that reveals its complexity over time. The significance of this approach lies in its expansion of the possibilities of painting. By emphasizing observation, materiality, and the multiplicity of vision, Northern artists demonstrate that the Renaissance is not defined by a single trajectory, but by the coexistence of multiple systems of representation. The Flemish school, through its commitment to detail and surface, reveals that the act of seeing itself can serve as the foundation of knowledge, transforming painting into a medium of inquiry rather than a mere vehicle of illusion. The history of Renaissance painting cannot be adequately understood as a sequence of isolated innovations or as a neutral progression toward technical refinement. It is structured through confrontation, comparison, and the continual redefinition of artistic identity within a competitive field. By the late 15th and early 16th centuries, the conditions of artistic production in cities such as Florence and Rome produced not only opportunities for innovation, but also an environment in which reputation, patronage, and intellectual authority were actively contested. The emergence of the artist as an individual figure, distinct from the collective structure of the workshop, intensifies this condition. Painters are no longer anonymous contributors to a shared visual language. They are named, evaluated, and positioned within hierarchies that are both constructed and reinforced through discourse, commission, and reception. Rivalry, in this context, is not an incidental byproduct of ambition. It is a structural force that shapes the development of painting itself. The confrontation between Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo provides one of the most concentrated expressions of this condition. Their opposition is frequently described in stylistic terms, yet such descriptions risk reducing a more fundamental divergence. The difference between them is not simply how they paint, but how they conceive the act of painting. Leonardo approaches the image as a problem of perception, grounded in the study of light, optics, and the physiological processes through which the eye apprehends the world. His writings consistently emphasize the instability of vision, the way in which distance, atmosphere, and illumination alter the appearance of forms. This attention to variability leads to a mode of painting in which contours are softened, edges dissolve, and forms emerge gradually, through tonal transitions. The technique later described as sfumato is not merely an aesthetic choice. It is a manifestation of a theoretical position. The visible world is not composed of fixed outlines, but of continuous shifts in light and shadow, and painting must reflect this condition if it is to approach truth. Michelangelo's conception of painting proceeds from an entirely different premise. His training as a sculptor informs his understanding of form as something that exists independently of its optical conditions. Where Leonardo treats form as contingent upon perception, Michelangelo treats it as inherent, something that can be revealed through the disciplined application of drawing. Disegno, in this context, is not simply a preparatory stage, but the intellectual foundation of the work. It is through drawing that the artist apprehends the structure of the body, its proportions, tensions, and potential for movement. Painting for Michelangelo becomes an extension of this process, a means of translating the clarity of drawing into color and surface. The figures that populate his works are defined by their internal coherence, their musculature articulated with precision, their presence asserted with a force that resists dissolution. This opposition between Leonardo and Michelangelo has been framed by scholars such as Martin Kemp and David Summers as a distinction between empirical observation and conceptual construction. Leonardo's engagement with nature is analytical, grounded in the study of phenomena that can be observed and recorded. Michelangelo's approach is synthetic, assembling forms according to principles that exceed immediate observation. Yet this distinction should not be understood as a simple binary. Leonardo's work is not devoid of conceptual structure, nor is Michelangelo's devoid of observation. What differentiates them is the relative weight assigned to each. Leonardo begins with perception and moves toward understanding. Michelangelo begins with conception and imposes it upon the visible. The rivalry between these two figures is not confined to theoretical discourse. It is enacted within specific historical moments, most notably in the commissions for the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence. In 1504, Leonardo was commissioned to paint the Battle of Anghiari, while Michelangelo was tasked with the Battle of Cassina. These works are intended to occupy opposing walls, creating a direct confrontation between two approaches to representation. Although neither painting is completed, the surviving cartoons and contemporary descriptions provide insight into the nature of this competition. Leonardo's composition emphasizes the chaos of battle, the entanglement of figures and horses, and the psychological intensity of conflict. Movement is conveyed through the interaction of forms, through the tension between forces that appear to collide and dissolve. Michelangelo's composition, by contrast, focuses on the human body, presenting soldiers caught in a moment of sudden action. The figures are arranged to display anatomical mastery, their poses extending the possibilities of movement and tension. The significance of this competition lies not in its outcome, but in the framework it establishes. It positions painting as a field in which different approaches can be compared, evaluated, and ranked. Giorgio Vasari's account of this moment reinforces its importance, presenting it as a defining instance of artistic rivalry. Vasari's narrative, while shaped by his own biases, contributes to the construction of a historical model in which progress is achieved through competition. The artist is defined not only by what they produce, but by how they measure against others. Raphael enters this field at a moment when the terms of this rivalry have already been established. His position is neither oppositional nor derivative, but integrative. He studies the works of Leonardo and Michelangelo with a degree of attention that suggests both admiration and strategic adaptation. From Leonardo, he absorbs a sensitivity to composition, the arrangement of figures within a coherent spatial system, and the use of light to create depth. From Michelangelo, he adopts a sense of structural clarity, the articulation of the body as a coherent form. Yet Raphael's achievement lies in his ability to reorganize these elements into a system that prioritizes legibility and balance. In the School of Athens, this reorganization is articulated with exceptional clarity. The architectural framework, constructed through linear perspective, provides a stable structure within which figures are arranged. The vanishing point, located between Plato and Aristotle, organizes the composition both spatially and conceptually. The figures are grouped according to their intellectual relationships, creating a network of interactions that can be read simultaneously as a spatial arrangement and a philosophical discourse. The clarity of the composition allows the viewer to navigate this network without difficulty. Complexity is present, but it is controlled. Raphael's engagement with Michelangelo is particularly evident in the inclusion of the figure of Heraclitus, often interpreted as a portrait of Michelangelo himself. This figure, seated and isolated, introduces a moment of tension within an otherwise harmonious composition. It acknowledges the presence of Michelangelo's influence, while containing it within a broader system. Raphael does not attempt to surpass Michelangelo through opposition. He incorporates him, transforming rivalry into synthesis. The relationship between these artists is further complicated by the role of Rome as a center of artistic production. The papal court, particularly under Julius II and Leo X, becomes a site where artistic competition is institutionalized. Commissions for major projects, such as the Vatican Stanza and the Sistine Chapel, bring artists into direct proximity, creating conditions in which influence and rivalry intersect. The visibility of these works amplifies their impact, contributing to the formation of reputations that extend beyond local contexts. The dynamics of rivalry extend beyond individual artists to encompass regional distinctions, most notably between Florence and Venice. This distinction has often been framed as a contrast between disegno and color, between the primacy of drawing and the primacy of color. While such formulations risk oversimplification, they reflect differing priorities in how painting is understood and practiced. In Florence, the emphasis on drawing is linked to the intellectualization of art, the idea that the image is constructed through rational principles. In Venice, the emphasis on color reflects a different engagement with perception, one that prioritizes the sensory experience of the image. Titian's work exemplifies this Venetian approach. In his paintings, form emerges through the interaction of color, through the modulation of tones that define volume without reliance on contour. The surface of the painting is active, the brushwork visible, contributing to the construction of the image. As David Rosand has argued, Venetian painting redefines the relationship between material and representation, emphasizing the physical presence of paint as integral to the work. The image is not a transparent window, but a surface that asserts its own materiality. The contrast between Florence and Venice is not absolute. Artists travel, works circulate, and ideas are exchanged, yet the distinction highlights the multiplicity of approaches within the Renaissance. Rivalry operates not only between individuals, but between systems of thought, between different ways of understanding what painting can be. Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, and Titian do not represent a linear progression. They represent a field of possibilities, a set of positions that define the boundaries of artistic practice. Their interactions, whether direct or indirect, contribute to the expansion of these boundaries. Rivalry, in this sense, is not a conflict to be resolved, but a condition to be sustained. It produces differences that generate new questions, new approaches, and new forms. The significance of rivalry lies in its capacity to reveal the underlying assumptions of artistic practice. It forces articulation, making visible the principles that guide the construction of the image. Through comparison, artists define what they value, what they reject, and what they seek to achieve. The image becomes not only a representation, but a statement, a position within a broader discourse. As the 16th century progresses, these dynamics become increasingly embedded within systems of patronage and institutional power. The competition for commissions, the influence of courts and religious authorities, and the circulation of artworks across regions all contribute to the shaping of artistic practice. Rivalry becomes part of a larger structure in which art functions as both cultural expression and instrument of power. It is within this structure that the next stage of our inquiry unfolds, as we consider how patronage not only supports artistic production, but defines its conditions, determining what is made, how it is seen, and the purposes it serves. The production of Renaissance painting cannot be understood apart from the systems of patronage that determine its conditions, its visibility, and its meaning. The image does not emerge as an autonomous object generated solely through the intentions of the artist or the internal logic of technique. It is shaped, constrained, and enabled by networks of power that define what is commissioned, where it is placed, and how it is encountered. Patronage is therefore not an external support structure. It is constitutive of the work itself. It organizes the relationship between artist, image, and viewer, embedding painting within political, religious, and social frameworks that extend far beyond the site of production. The Renaissance does not simply transform how images are made. It transforms the conditions under which images acquire authority. To situate patronage within this framework requires a shift away from viewing it as a background condition and toward recognizing it as a primary determinant of form. Michael Baxendall's formulation of the conditions of trade provides a foundational model for this analysis, emphasizing that artistic production is shaped through a system of negotiations between patron and artist. Contracts specify not only subject matter and scale, but also materials, deadlines, and levels of finish, creating a framework within which the artist operates. These specifications are not neutral constraints that limit creativity. They actively shape the decisions through which the image is constructed. The painter responds to expectations that are themselves culturally and institutionally determined. Style, in this context, is inseparable from patronage. It is not simply an expression of individual vision, but a response to a structured demand. The city of Florence offers one of the most fully articulated examples of this relationship, particularly through the patronage of the Medici family. The Medici operate not merely as collectors or sponsors, but as architects of a visual culture in which art functions as a vehicle of political legitimacy. Their patronage encompasses public commissions, private works, architectural projects, and the cultivation of intellectual networks that include humanist scholars, philosophers, and artists. The integration of these elements produces a system in which artistic production becomes a means of constructing civic identity. Florentine patronage operates across multiple registers. In public spaces, art functions as a visible manifestation of communal values. The decoration of churches, civic buildings, and piazzas contributes to a shared visual environment in which order, virtue, and stability are articulated through form. These works are not neutral embellishments. They participate in the construction of a political narrative, reinforcing the authority of those who commission them. The placement of an image within a public space determines not only its visibility, but its function, aligning it with the rhythms of civic life. Private patronage, by contrast, operates within domestic interiors, where the image engages the viewer in a more intimate mode of encounter. Paintings commissioned for private devotion or display are designed to be experienced at close range, encouraging sustained attention. The scale, subject matter, and level of detail reflect this context. Yet the distinction between public and private does not diminish the role of power. It reconfigures it. The domestic interior becomes a site in which identity is constructed and displayed, where the patron's taste, knowledge, and status are made visible through the selection and arrangement of images. The Medici exemplify this dual function of patronage. Their commissions contribute to the shaping of Florence as a cultural centre, while simultaneously reinforcing their position within the city's political structure. Works associated with their patronage are not merely aesthetic objects. They are instruments through which authority is articulated. As Laura Martinez and Dale Kent have demonstrated, the Medici's engagement with art is inseparable from their broader strategy of consolidating power, in which visual culture plays a central role. The papal court in Rome extends this model on a scale that transforms its implications. Under Julius II and his successors, Rome became a site in which artistic production was mobilized as an instrument of institutional authority. The commissioning of large-scale projects such as the Sistine Chapel ceiling and the Vatican stands reflects a deliberate effort to align visual representation with theological and political objectives. These works are not isolated commissions. They form part of a coordinated program in which painting, architecture, and sculpture operate together to construct an environment that embodies the authority of the Church. In the Vatican stanza, Raphael's frescoes articulate a vision of knowledge that integrates classical philosophy with Christian doctrine. The School of Athens presents philosophy as a structured and coherent system, organized through perspective and composition. The clarity of the image is not merely aesthetic. It serves a rhetorical function, presenting knowledge as ordered and accessible. The viewer is positioned within a space that appears rational and unified, reinforcing the idea that the Church is the site where intellectual traditions converge. As Ingrid Rowland has noted, the integration of classical and Christian elements within these frescoes reflects a broader humanist project that seeks to reconcile different modes of knowledge within a single framework. Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling operates within the same institutional context, but produces a different mode of engagement. The scale of the work transforms the viewer's experience, requiring movement and sustained attention. The representation of the human body becomes central, not only as a demonstration of artistic skill, but as a vehicle for theological meaning. The figures that populate the ceiling are not passive illustrations of biblical narratives. They are active forms, whose gestures and positions create a dynamic field of visual relationships. The integration of painting with architecture produces an environment in which the viewer is enveloped by the image, reinforcing the authority of the institution through immersion. The function of these works cannot be reduced to their content. It lies in their capacity to organize perception. Louis Marien's analysis of representation provides a framework for understanding this function. For Marin, images do not merely depict power. They produce it by making it visible and therefore legible. Representation is an act of construction in which authority is articulated through form. The coherence of Renaissance painting, its capacity to present a unified and persuasive image of the world, enhances its effectiveness as a medium of power. The image does not simply reflect reality. It constructs a version of reality that appears stable and convincing. This construction is particularly evident in religious imagery, where the stakes of representation extend beyond aesthetics into the domain of belief. The image functions as an intermediary between the viewer and the sacred, shaping how religious narratives are understood and experienced. The development of naturalism and perspective increases the immediacy of this encounter, producing images that appear more accessible and more compelling. David Friedberg's analysis of the power of images emphasizes the affective dimension of this process, arguing that images elicit responses that are not fully contained within rational interpretation. The emotional engagement produced by gesture, expression, and spatial coherence contributes to the persuasive force of the image. The integration of painting within ritual contexts further intensifies this effect. Altarpieces, fresco cycles, and devotional panels are encountered within spaces that structure the viewer's experience through movement, sound, and collective practice. The image is not an isolated object, but part of a larger system in which visual and performative elements interact. The placement of an image within a church, for example, determines how it is seen, aligning it with specific points within the liturgical sequence. The viewer's position is not arbitrary. It is structured by the architecture and the practices that take place within it. The courts of Italy provide additional contexts in which patronage operates as a structuring force. In Mantua, under the Gonzaga family, artists such as Andrea Mantegna produce works that integrate classical themes with contemporary political concerns. In Urbino, the court of Federico da Montefeltro became a center of humanist learning, where painting is aligned with intellectual inquiry. In Ferrara, the Este family supports a range of artistic practices that reflect their engagement with both local and international developments. Each of these courts develops its own mode of patronage, shaped by the priorities and ambitions of its rulers. Francis Haskell's analysis of patronage emphasizes that the meaning of a work is inseparable from the conditions under which it is commissioned and displayed. The same image may function differently depending on its context, its placement, and its audience. Patronage determines not only what is produced, but how it is received. The reception of a painting is not a neutral process. It is shaped by the expectations and frameworks established by the patron. The relationship between patronage and artistic innovation is complex. On one hand, patronage provides the resources necessary for experimentation, enabling artists to develop new techniques and explore new forms. On the other hand, it imposes constraints that limit the range of possible subjects and approaches. The subjects of Renaissance painting remain largely traditional, dominated by religious narratives and themes. Innovation operates within these boundaries, enhancing the effectiveness of the image rather than replacing its function. This tension is evident in the careers of individual artists. Leonardo's engagement with scientific inquiry, Michelangelo's emphasis on the body, and Raphael's synthesis of different approaches all occur within systems of patronage that shape their work. The artist does not operate outside of these systems. They navigate them, negotiating between their own interests and the demands of their patrons. The image is the result of this negotiation, reflecting both the intentions of the artist and the constraints of the context. The increasing visibility of artists within these systems contributes to the transformation of their status. As painting becomes associated with intellectual inquiry, the artist is positioned as a figure capable of engaging with knowledge, rather than merely executing tasks. This elevation is reinforced by theoretical writing, by the circulation of works, and by the recognition of individual styles. Yet this shift does not eliminate the dependence on patronage. It complicates it. The artist gains recognition, but remains embedded within structures that define the conditions of production. The long-term impact of patronage on the history of art is reflected in the formation of the canon. The works that are preserved, studied, and displayed are those that have been supported by institutions capable of sustaining them. The prominence of certain artists and works is not solely a function of their intrinsic qualities, but of the systems that have enabled their survival. Museums, collections, and academic discourse continue to reflect these historical conditions, reinforcing the visibility of the works that were originally produced within specific contexts of power. To understand Renaissance painting is therefore to understand the interplay between artistic practice and the structures that sustain it. Patronage determines what is made, where it is placed, and how it is seen. It shapes the conditions under which meaning is constructed and communicated. The image is not an autonomous object, but a node within a network of relationships that define its existence. This understanding leads to a further question. If painting operates within systems that define its function and meaning, how does the artist come to be understood as an independent and exceptional figure? The emergence of the artist as an intellectual capable of transcending the constraints of patronage, requires explanation within the very system that appears to limit it. It is this transformation, from maker to thinker, from artisan to intellectual, that defines the next stage of our inquiry. The transformation of Renaissance painting is inseparable from a redefinition of the artist. The developments that have been traced through perspective, perception, rivalry, and patronage do not merely alter how images are made. They alter how the maker of those images is understood, positioned, and valued within a broader hierarchy of knowledge. The artist, who in earlier periods operated within workshop structures governed by guild regulations and collective production, begins to emerge as an individual figure whose authority derives not only from manual skill, but from intellectual capacity. This shift is not reducible to stylistic change. It is the result of a sustained reconfiguration of artistic labor within humanist culture, theoretical writing, institutional transformation, and evolving systems of patronage. The Renaissance does not simply produce new images. It produces a new category of person, the artist as a thinker. In late medieval contexts, painting belongs to the domain of the mechanical arts, defined by its dependence on manual execution and its integration within systems of function. The painter's status is comparable to that of other craftsmen, whose work is valued for its utility within liturgical, civic, or decorative frameworks. Training occurs within workshops, structured by guild regulations, where apprentices acquire skills through imitation, repetition, and gradual participation in collective production. The identity of the individual maker is secondary to the completion of the work. Attribution exists, but it does not dominate interpretation. The image is encountered as part of a system of use, rather than as the expression of a singular mind. The emergence of humanism in the 15th century introduces a different conception of knowledge, one that privileges intellectual disciplines, classical learning, and the cultivation of individual capacity. Within this framework, the possibility arises for painting to be redefined as a form of knowledge, rather than as a purely manual activity. Leon Battista Alberti's treatise on painting constitutes one of the most decisive interventions in this process. Alberti argues that painting is grounded in geometry, optics, and proportion, aligning it with the liberal arts. This alignment does not merely elevate the status of painting, it transforms the criteria by which it is evaluated. The painter is no longer defined solely by skillful execution, but by the capacity to construct images according to rational principles. Alberti's formulation of disegno as the foundation of painting is central to this transformation. Disegno operates at multiple levels, encompassing both the act of drawing and the conceptual structure that underlies the image. It positions the artist as someone who organizes visual information, who translates the visible world into a system that can be constructed and understood. Drawing becomes a mode of thinking, a process through which the artist analyzes form, space, and proportion. Painting, in turn, becomes the realization of this conceptual framework. The image is no longer a surface upon which forms are applied. It is the product of an intellectual operation. This reconceptualization of painting is further developed in the writings of Leonardo da Vinci, who explicitly defines painting as a science. Leonardo's notebooks reveal an engagement with optics, anatomy, hydrodynamics, and natural philosophy that extends far beyond the boundaries of artistic practice. For Leonardo, the painter must understand the laws that govern the behavior of light, the structure of the human body, and the mechanisms of perception. Painting becomes a means of investigating these phenomena, a form of empirical inquiry that operates through observation and analysis. The claim that painting is a science is not metaphorical. It asserts that the painter participates in the production of knowledge. The implications of Leonardo's position are profound. If painting is a science, then the painter is not merely a maker, but a knower. The image becomes a site where knowledge is constructed and communicated. This position challenges the traditional hierarchy that separates intellectual activity from manual labor. It suggests that the act of making can itself be a form of thinking, that the manipulation of materials can produce insight into the nature of the world. Martin Kemp has argued that Leonardo's conception of painting collapses the distinction between art and science, positioning the image as a medium through which understanding is generated, rather than simply represented. At the same time, the elevation of painting as a science introduces a tension between empirical observation and conceptual construction. While Leonardo emphasizes observation, other artists and theorists prioritize the role of invention, the capacity to generate forms that extend beyond what is immediately visible. This tension is articulated in the distinction between imitazione and invenzione, between the reproduction of nature and the creation of new forms. The artist is expected not only to observe, but to transform, to organize the visible world according to principles that reflect intellectual judgment. The consolidation of the artist as an intellectual figure depends not only on theoretical writing, but on the development of discourse that frames artistic production within a historical narrative. Giorgio Vasari's Lives of the Most Excellent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects plays a central role in this process. Vasari does not simply record the works of artists. He constructs a history in which artistic development is understood as a progression toward increasing perfection. This narrative is structured around individual achievement, with artists positioned as agents of innovation whose contributions define the trajectory of art. Vasari's emphasis on biography introduces a new mode of interpretation in which the life of the artist becomes integral to the understanding of the work. Artistic production is explained through personality, temperament, and intellectual capacity. The painting is no longer encountered solely as an object. It is encountered as the manifestation of a particular mind. This shift reinforces the centrality of the artist within the discourse of art, contributing to the formation of a canon organized around individual names. The concept of ingegno, or genius, emerges within this framework as a defining attribute. It denotes a capacity for invention and synthesis that exceeds the limits of training. Genius is understood as a natural gift, unevenly distributed, that enables certain individuals to produce works of exceptional significance. This concept contributes to the construction of a hierarchy in which artists are ranked according to their perceived capacity for innovation. The identification of genius is not neutral. It produces distinction, elevating certain figures while marginalizing others. The modern critique of this model has emphasized the extent to which the concept of genius obscures the conditions under which artistic production occurs. Ernst Gombrich's theory of making and matching suggests that artistic innovation arises not from isolated inspiration, but from the modification of existing conventions. Artists work within traditions, responding to problems and adjusting solutions in ways that produce change over time. Michael Baxendall's analysis of the period eye situates artistic production within social and economic contexts, arguing that the way images are made and perceived is shaped by culturally specific habits of attention. Erwin Panofsky's work further complicates the notion of artistic autonomy by demonstrating that visual systems such as perspective are historically constructed. Perspective is not a natural or universal mode of representation. It is a cultural system that organizes vision according to specific principles. The artist's engagement with perspective reflects participation in a broader intellectual framework rather than independent invention. The image is shaped by the tools, concepts, and expectations that define its context. More recent scholarship has extended this critique by examining the ideological functions of the artist as a category. T.J. Clark has argued that the figure of the artist cannot be understood apart from the social relations that structure artistic production. The emphasis on individual genius can obscure the extent to which art is embedded within systems of power, patronage, and ideology. The artist's identity is not simply expressed through the work. It is produced through a network of relationships that define its meaning. The persistence of the artist as an intellectual figure within art history reflects the explanatory power of this model. It provides a framework for organizing works, for tracing stylistic development, and for attributing significance. Yet it also imposes limitations, privileging certain forms of production while excluding others, collaborative practices, anonymous works, and forms of art that do not conform to the model of individual authorship are often marginalized within this framework. The Renaissance does not simply reveal the artist as an intellectual figure. It constructs the conditions under which such a figure can be recognized. The development of theoretical writing, the role of patronage, the formation of historical narratives, and the establishment of institutions all contribute to this construction. The artist emerges not as an isolated genius, but as a product of these conditions. The image in turn reflects this transformation. It becomes a site in which intellectual activity is made visible, where the processes of analysis, invention, and construction are embodied in form. The surface of the painting, the arrangement of figures, the modulation of light, all bear the trace of decisions that can be understood as intellectual acts. The viewer is invited not only to see, but to recognize the presence of thought within the image. This recognition is sustained through the institutions that preserve and interpret art. Museums, collections, and academic discourse continue to organize works around individual artists, reinforcing the centrality of authorship. The Renaissance model of the artist persists, shaping how art is understood and valued. To understand this persistence is to recognize that the artist as an intellectual is not a natural category, but a historical construction. It reflects specific choices about how art is defined, how it is interpreted, and how it is remembered. The Renaissance establishes a framework that continues to structure the field of art history, influencing both scholarly analysis and public perception. As we move toward the final stage of this inquiry, the focus shifts from the construction of the artist to the construction of the canon. The narratives that define artistic genius, the selection of works that are preserved and studied, and the institutions that sustain these processes all contribute to the formation of a history that appears coherent and stable. Yet this coherence is itself constructed, the result of decisions that determine which artists are included and which are excluded. It is this process of selection and narrative formation that defines the writing of the masters and the persistence of their authority within the museum and beyond. The emergence of the artist as an intellectual figure does not complete the transformation initiated during the Renaissance. It requires a further step: the stabilization of that figure within a narrative that can be transmitted, repeated, and institutionalized. The elevation of certain artists above others, the identification of particular works as exemplary, and the organization of artistic production into a coherent historical sequence are not self-evident outcomes. They are constructed through writing. The Renaissance not only produces artists, it produces a discourse that defines which artists matter, how they are to be understood, and why their works continue to command attention. The formation of this discourse marks the transition from artistic practice to art history. Giorgio Vasari's lives of the most excellent painters, sculptors, and architects occupies a central position within this transformation. It is not the first attempt to record the activities of artists, yet it is the first to organize them into a comprehensive, historical narrative structured around individual achievement. Vasari's project is not descriptive in a neutral sense. It is selective, evaluative, and teleological. It constructs a history in which artistic development is presented as a progression toward increasing perfection, culminating in the works of Michelangelo. This structure imposes coherence on a field that is, in practice, heterogeneous and discontinuous. The concept of progress that underlies Vasari's narrative reflects broader humanist assumptions about the recovery and advancement of knowledge. The Renaissance is framed as a rebirth, a moment in which the study of antiquity leads to the renewal of artistic practice. Earlier periods are characterized as incomplete or deficient, serving as stages that precede the achievement of a fully realized art. This formulation produces a hierarchy in which certain artists are positioned as precursors, others as innovators, and a select few as masters, who achieve a level of perfection that defines the standard for all that follows. Central to this narrative is the role of biography. Vasari structures his account through the lives of individual artists, presenting their works as expressions of their character, intellect, and temperament. Artistic production is explained through personal attributes, with qualities such as diligence, ingenuity, and ambition, serving as explanatory tools. The life becomes a framework through which the work is interpreted, and the work, in turn, serves as evidence of the life. This reciprocal relationship reinforces the centrality of the artist as an individual figure, whose identity is inseparable from the objects they produce. The emphasis on individual achievement introduces a set of evaluative criteria that shape the interpretation of art. Terms such as disegno, invenzione, and maniera function as markers of artistic quality, distinguishing works that demonstrate conceptual clarity, originality, and stylistic refinement. These criteria are not neutral descriptors. They are part of a system that privileges certain approaches to painting over others, aligning artistic value with intellectual capacity. The elevation of disegno, in particular, reinforces the association of painting with rational structure and conceptual design, contributing to the broader redefinition of the artist as an intellectual. The formation of a canon emerges from this process. Certain artists are selected, their works preserved and studied, while others are omitted or marginalized. The canon is not simply a collection of exemplary works. It is a structure that organizes knowledge, defining what is considered significant within a given field. The persistence of names such as Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael within art historical discourse reflects the success of this structure. Their inclusion within Vasari's narrative contributes to their continued prominence, reinforcing their status across generations. The selectivity of this process raises questions about what is excluded. Artists whose works do not conform to the criteria established by Vasari, or whose production falls outside the geographical and cultural focus of his narrative, are often absent. The emphasis on central Italian painting, particularly that of Florence and Rome, contributes to the marginalization of other traditions, including those of the Northern Renaissance. This exclusion is not merely a matter of oversight. It reflects the priorities and assumptions that shape the construction of the canon. Modern scholarship has critically examined this process, challenging the idea that the canon reflects an objective measure of artistic quality. Ernst Gombrich's analysis of artistic tradition emphasizes the role of inherited conventions, suggesting that innovation arises through the modification of existing practices rather than through isolated acts of genius. Michael Baxendall's work situates artistic production within specific social and economic contexts, arguing that style is shaped by the conditions under which it is produced. These approaches shift attention away from the individual as the primary source of value and toward the structures that define how art is made and understood. Erwin Panofsky's iconological method further complicates the interpretation of Renaissance art by demonstrating that images operate within systems of meaning that extend beyond formal analysis. The significance of a work cannot be fully understood through its composition or technique alone. It requires an understanding of the cultural, intellectual, and symbolic frameworks within which it was produced. This perspective challenges the emphasis on individual authorship by situating the image within a broader network of references and associations. The construction of artistic identity through writing also involves the production of myth. Vasari's accounts frequently include anecdotes that emphasize the exceptional qualities of certain artists, presenting them as figures whose abilities surpass those of their contemporaries. These narratives contribute to the formation of a cultural image of the artist as a genius, a figure whose work appears to transcend the conditions of its production. The persistence of these myths within both scholarly and popular discourse reinforces the authority of the artists they describe. The role of institutions in sustaining this narrative cannot be overlooked. Museums, academies, and collections function as sites in which the canon is materialized and displayed. The arrangement of works within these spaces reflects the priorities established through historical writing, reinforcing the visibility of certain artists and the marginalization of others. The museum, in particular, operates as a space where the narrative of art history is made tangible, guiding the viewer through a sequence of works that appear to represent a coherent progression. The relationship between writing and display is reciprocal. The narratives constructed by authors such as Vasari inform the selection and arrangement of works, while the visibility of these works reinforces the narratives that describe them. This feedback loop contributes to the stability of the canon, making it appear natural and self-evident. Yet this stability is contingent, dependent on the continued reproduction of the structures that support it. The persistence of the Renaissance masters within contemporary discourse reflects the durability of this construction. Their works continue to be studied, exhibited, and reproduced, their names functioning as markers of artistic achievement. This persistence is not simply a reflection of their intrinsic qualities. It is the result of a historical process that has elevated and sustained their status. To understand the writing of the masters is therefore to recognize the extent to which art history is itself a constructed field. The narratives that define artistic value, the criteria that determine inclusion, and the institutions that sustain these structures all contribute to the formation of a history that appears coherent and authoritative. Yet this coherence is the result of selection, interpretation, and repetition. As we approach the conclusion of this inquiry, the focus shifts from the construction of the canon to its implications. The persistence of certain names, the stability of certain narratives, and the authority of certain works raise questions about how the past is represented and how it continues to shape the present. The museum, as the site where these narratives are encountered, becomes a space in which history is both preserved and constructed. It is within this space that the final stage of our exploration unfolds, as we consider the endurance of these structures and the conditions under which they may be re-examined. The narrative that has been constructed across the Renaissance does not end with the works themselves. It persists through the systems that preserve, organize, and present those works, shaping how they are encountered long after the conditions of their production have passed. The museum, as the dominant institution through which art is experienced in the modern world, does not simply house objects. It structures their meaning. It arranges them within sequences, assigns them to categories, and situates them within narratives that appear coherent and stable. The Renaissance, as it is commonly understood, exists not only as a historical period, but as a configuration produced through these institutional practices. The museum does not merely display the Renaissance, it constructs it. To enter the museum is to enter a space in which time has been reorganized, works that were produced in different cities, for different patrons, and under different conditions, are brought together and presented as part of a unified narrative. The separation between painting and its original context is both physical and conceptual. Altarpieces are removed from churches, frescoes are detached from walls, and objects designed for specific architectural settings are relocated into galleries. This displacement alters the conditions under which the works are seen. The image, once embedded within systems of ritual, patronage, and function, is redefined as an autonomous object, available for aesthetic contemplation. This transformation is not neutral. It reflects a shift in the understanding of art from a functional and contextual practice to a category defined by its capacity to be viewed, interpreted, and preserved. The museum isolates the work from the conditions of its production, emphasizing its formal qualities and its relationship to other works within the collection. The arrangement of objects within galleries creates a sequence that suggests continuity, guiding the viewer through a progression that appears logical and inevitable. This sequence is not given. It is constructed. The persistence of certain names within this structure reinforces the centrality of the artist as a category. Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, and others appear not only as historical figures, but as organizing principles within the museum. Their works are grouped, labeled, and interpreted in ways that emphasize individual authorship, contributing to the perception that the history of art is a history of great individuals. This perception is sustained through repetition, through the continued presentation of these names as central to the narrative. The authority of the museum derives in part from its capacity to stabilize meaning. The arrangement of works, the presence of labels, and the structure of exhibitions all contribute to the formation of an interpretive framework that guides the viewer's understanding. The museum does not simply present objects for interpretation. It shapes the conditions under which interpretation occurs. The viewer is positioned within a system that organizes attention, directing the gaze towards certain works and establishing relationships between them. Tony Bennett's analysis of the museum as an institution emphasizes its role in producing knowledge through display. The museum functions as a site in which objects are classified, ordered, and made visible in ways that align with broader cultural and ideological frameworks. The arrangement of works within the museum is not arbitrary. It reflects decisions about what is important, what is representative, and what is worthy of preservation. These decisions contribute to the formation of a canon, reinforcing the prominence of certain artists and the marginalization of others. The concept of the canon, as developed through the writings of Vasari and sustained through institutional practices, finds its material realization within the museum. The selection of works that are displayed, the allocation of space within galleries, and the resources devoted to conservation and research all contribute to the maintenance of this structure. The canon appears stable, yet it is the result of ongoing processes of selection and interpretation. Works that are included gain visibility and authority, while those that are excluded remain peripheral. The relationship between the viewer and the image is also transformed within this context. The museum constructs a mode of viewing that emphasizes contemplation, analysis, and comparison. The viewer moves through the space, encountering works in sequence, guided by the arrangement of the galleries. This movement produces a form of engagement that differs from the original context in which many Renaissance works were encountered. The altarpiece that once functioned within a liturgical framework is now viewed as an object of aesthetic interest. The fresco that once interacted with architecture is now understood through reproduction or fragment. The shift from function to contemplation does not eliminate the interpretive complexity of the work. It reconfigures it. The viewer is invited to consider the formal qualities of the image, its composition, its use of light and color, and its relationship to other works. This mode of viewing aligns with the intellectualization of art that emerged during the Renaissance, reinforcing the idea that painting is a form of knowledge, yet it also introduces a distance between the viewer and the conditions of production, separating the image from the systems that originally defined its meaning. The museum's role in constructing the Renaissance extends beyond the arrangement of works to the production of narratives that define the period. Catalogues, wall texts, and educational programs contribute to the dissemination of a particular understanding of art history. These narratives often emphasize continuity, presenting the Renaissance as a coherent and unified movement, characterized by specific developments, such as perspective, naturalism, and the emergence of the artist as an individual. While these elements are significant, their presentation as a unified narrative simplifies the complexity of the period. The persistence of this narrative reflects its explanatory power, yet it also reveals its limitations. The focus on central figures and major developments can obscure the diversity of practices that existed within the Renaissance, including regional variations and alternative approaches to representation. The museum, in presenting a curated selection of works, inevitably simplifies the field, privileging certain aspects while excluding others. The question that emerges from this analysis is not whether the museum misrepresents the Renaissance, but how it constructs a particular version of it. The works that are displayed, the narratives that accompany them, and the structure of the galleries all contribute to the formation of a perspective that appears natural and authoritative. This perspective is not fixed. It can be revised, expanded, and challenged through changes in curation, scholarship, and institutional priorities. Yet its persistence suggests that the structures that support it are deeply embedded. The experience of the museum at night, when it is empty of visitors, introduces a different relation to these structures. Without the movement of crowds, without the mediation of guided tours, the works appear in a state that is both suspended and stable. The absence of viewers does not diminish their presence. It alters the conditions under which they are encountered. The narratives that organize them remain, yet they become less immediate, less reinforced by the flow of interpretation that accompanies daytime viewing. In this stillness, the relationship between object and narrative becomes more apparent. The painting does not speak independently of the frameworks that define it. Its meaning is shaped by the systems that have placed it within the museum, by the histories that have been written about it, and by the categories that have been assigned to it. The viewer, in encountering the work within this space, participates in these systems, whether consciously or not. The persistence of the Renaissance masters within this context reflects the durability of the structures that have elevated them. Their works continue to be displayed, studied, and reproduced, their names functioning as markers of artistic achievement. This persistence is not solely a function of their intrinsic qualities. It is the result of a historical process that has constructed and maintained their authority. To recognize this process is not to diminish the significance of the works. It is to understand the conditions under which that significance is produced and sustained. The museum does not merely preserve the past. It shapes the way the past is understood, organizing it into forms that can be encountered in the present. As the museum prepares to reopen, the stillness that allows for this reflection begins to dissolve. The arrival of visitors reactivates the systems that structure the experience of the works, restoring the flow of interpretation and engagement. The paintings remain in place, their positions unchanged, yet their relation to the viewer shifts once again. The Renaissance, as it appears within the museum, continues to exist, not as a fixed historical reality, but as a constructed field of meaning, sustained through the practices that bring it into view. The museum remains, not as a neutral container of objects, but as an active participant in the construction of art history, a space in which the past is continually reorganized and made present through the act of display.